Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I used to love camping. For as long as I can remember, it was something my family did every summer. We'd load up our car with tents, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last a lifetime. By the time we hit the road, my parents would already be arguing about the fastest way to get to the campground, and my little brother Adam would be asking, "Are we there yet?" on repeat. It was chaotic, but it was ours. But everything changed in the summer of 2019. I was 13 that year, teetering on the edge of childhood and whatever came next. Camping wasn't as exciting as it used to be. I didn't look forward to skipping rocks at the lake or roasting marshmallows like I once had. My friends back home were hanging out at the mall or binge-watching TV shows, and I felt like I was missing out. Still, Pine Ridge Campground had been our summer tradition for years, and I couldn't exactly opt out. The trip started the same as always. My dad was in charge of pitching the tent, though it always took twice as long as it should have. My mom set up the camp kitchen, which she treated like it was a 5-star restaurant. Adam was too little to help, so he wandered off to chase squirrels or collect rocks. And me? I hopped on my bike and explored. Pine Ridge was huge, bigger than any other campground I'd been to. The campsites were spread out, separated by tall trees and trails that twisted and turned like a maze. There was a playground by the lake, a small convenience store that sold ice cream, and even an arcade that lit up like a beacon after dark. But what really made Pine Ridge special was how wild it felt. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and at night, you could hear the hoot of owls and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. That summer, though, something about the place felt different. Or maybe I was the one who'd changed. Being the only older kid around, I spent most of my time alone. Adam was only 6, and while he was adorable in his own way, his idea of fun didn't exactly align with mine. My parents, on the other hand, seemed thrilled to leave me to my own devices. As long as I checked in every now and then, they didn't mind me wandering around the campground. The first few days passed uneventfully. I biked along the trails, stopping occasionally to skip stones at the lake or grab an ice cream cone. But no matter how much I tried to enjoy myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. Just a strange heaviness in the air, like the trees were leaning in a little too close, watching. One afternoon, I found myself biking along the far edge of the campground. This was the quieter part, where the trees grew thicker and the campsites were fewer and farther between. It was peaceful in a way, but also unnervingly silent. I was pedaling along a narrow trail when I saw it. A cabin, half hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. I'd seen it before, but only from a distance. It was older than the other cabins, with weathered wood and a sagging roof. The windows were dark, and the porch was cluttered with fallen leaves. Most of the time, I passed it without a second thought, but that day, something caught my eye. The front door was slightly open, just enough to make me stop. I hit the brakes, my tires crunching against the gravel. For a moment, I just stared at the cabin. I'd ridden past it at least a dozen times since we'd arrived, and I was certain the door had always been shut. It wasn't the kind of place people usually stayed at. It looked too run down for that. And yet, there it was. The door, cracked open like an invitation. I stayed where I was, my heart thudding in my chest. Maybe someone was staying there after all. Maybe they'd forgotten to shut the door. Or maybe... My mind raced with possibilities. It had been open all along, and I just hadn't noticed. I leaned forward on my handlebars, squinting at the cabin as if I could will the door to swing shut. It didn't. Instead, the breeze shifted, rustling the trees and sending a shiver down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, though I wasn't sure what I expected to happen. The cabin stayed silent, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I glanced over my shoulder, half hoping someone would appear on the trail behind me, someone to break the eerie stillness. But the trail was empty, the only sound the distant chirp of birds. I should have left then. I should have turned my bike around and pedaled back to the busy part of the campground, back to where everything felt safe and normal. But something about that cabin drew me in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was boredom. Or maybe it was that nagging voice in my head, the one that said I was being silly, that there was nothing to be afraid of. I propped my bike against a tree and stepped closer, my sneakers crunching on the gravel. The cabin seemed bigger up close, its wooden walls towering over me. The door, slightly ajar, revealed only darkness inside. My stomach twisted, but I told myself I was just imagining things. "It's just an old cabin," I whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it true. I climbed the creaking steps onto the porch, each one groaning under my weight. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I could feel the cool air drifting out from inside, carrying with it a faint, musty smell. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. For a moment, there was nothing. Then from somewhere deep inside the cabin, a voice answered. "Come in," it said, low and raspy. "It's okay." I froze, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure whoever was inside could hear it. The voice was calm, almost friendly, but there was something about it that sent a chill through me. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Before I could move, the door creaked open wider, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. He was tall and thin, with long, greasy hair that hung down to his shoulders. His clothes were rumpled and dirty, and his face was lined with deep wrinkles. But it was his eyes that caught me, the way they locked onto mine, unblinking and intense. "Don't be scared," he said, stepping forward. "I just want to talk." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the porch. My hands fumbled for the railing as the man stepped closer, his crooked smile widening. "Wait," he said, his voice sharper now. "Don't go." But I didn't wait. I turned and bolted, leaping off the porch and grabbing my bike in one motion. My legs burned as I pedaled away, the trees blurring into a wall of green around me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I was back at our campsite, my chest heaving and my heart pounding. That night, I didn't say a word to my parents. I wanted to tell them, but the words got stuck in my throat. What would I even say? That I'd gone poking around where I shouldn't have and scared myself silly? They'd probably just laugh and tell me to stay closer to the campsite. So instead, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of our tent and listening to the wind rustling through the trees. And in the silence, I couldn't stop wondering, who was that man? And what would have happened if I hadn't run? The night after I saw the man at the cabin, I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, his face appeared. The thin, drawn features, the greasy hair, the crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His voice echoed in my mind, low and raspy, beckoning me to come inside. It felt like he had carved himself into my thoughts, like a permanent mark I couldn't erase. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. It wasn't entirely impossible, right? Maybe the shadows inside the cabin had played tricks on me. Maybe the voice was just the wind carrying sounds from somewhere else. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't going back there, not ever. But as the day wore on, that nagging feeling of curiosity began to creep back in. The logical part of my brain told me to stay far away, but the other part, the one that couldn't let things go, kept whispering, "What if you imagined it? What if it wasn't real?" By the afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. Not knowing was worse than anything else. So, against my better judgment, I decided to go back to the cabin. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, If my parents asked, I'd just say I was riding around the trails. They wouldn't think twice about it. The ride to the cabin felt longer than usual. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. The campground felt emptier than usual, like the usual hum of life had been swallowed up by the thick canopy of trees overhead. By the time I reached the cabin, my hands were slick with sweat, and my heart was already racing. It looked the same as it had the day before, old, weathered, and forgotten. The door was still cracked open, just like I remembered. My bike wobbled to a stop as I stared at the cabin, my stomach twisting with a mix of fear and anticipation. "What are you doing here?" a voice in my head demanded. "Turn around. Just go home." But I didn't turn around. Instead, I propped my bike against a tree and slowly approached the cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself was trying to hold me back. When I reached the porch, I hesitated, my hands trembling at my sides. The air around the cabin felt colder, almost as if the place had its own atmosphere. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing." I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under my sneakers. My eyes darted to the door, still slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck as I reached out and pushed the door open wider. It creaked loudly, the sound slicing through the quiet. The room inside was dim, lit only by the sunlight streaming through cracks in the wooden walls. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. The furniture was sparse, a sagging couch in one corner, a wooden table with a broken leg, and a stone fireplace filled with cold gray ashes. The cabin looked abandoned, just as I had thought. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Footprints. They were faint, but visible in the thick layer of dust that coated the wooden floor. They led from the doorway to the back of the cabin, where a small hallway disappeared into darkness. My heart thudded as I followed them with my eyes, my breath catching in my throat. Someone's been here, I thought. Someone's still here. I should have left right then and there, but my legs didn't move. Instead, I found myself stepping inside, my sneakers leaving their own tracks in the dust. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking. For a moment there was silence. Then, from somewhere in the back of the cabin, I heard it. A faint shuffling sound, like footsteps. My stomach dropped. I froze in place, every muscle in my body tensed. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The shuffling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, like the world itself was holding its breath. I took a step back, my eyes locked on the dark hallway. My brain screamed at me to run, but before I could move, a figure appeared. It was the man, the same man I had seen the day before. He stepped out of the shadows, his thin frame barely filling the doorway. His long, greasy hair clung to his face, and his clothes looked even dirtier up close. His smile was back, but it was different this time. Wider, more forced, like he was trying too hard to seem friendly. "Hey there, kid," he said, his voice low and uneven. "You came back." I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, and my chest ached with the effort of holding my breath. The man took a step forward, and I stumbled back, my hands fumbling for something to grab onto. "Don't be scared," he said, his tone soft but unsettling. "I just want to talk." I shook my head, finally finding my voice. I have to go," I stammered. The man's smile faltered. "Wait," he said, his voice sharper now. "Don't leave." He reached out a hand, and that was all it took. I turned and bolted for the door, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. I didn't look back. I didn't care if he was following me. All I cared about was getting out of there. When I reached my bike, I jumped on and pedaled away as fast as I could. The trail blurred around me, the trees rushing past in a haze of green and brown. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't stop until I was back at our campsite. When I got back, my parents were sitting by the campfire, laughing about something Adam had said. They looked so normal, so calm, that for a moment, I wondered if I should tell them what had happened, but the words caught in my throat. What would I even say? That I had gone into an old cabin and found a creepy man who might have been living there? They'd probably laugh it off, or worse, get mad at me for going there in the first place. So I said nothing. I sat down by the fire, staring into the flames and trying to calm my racing thoughts. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that man. The way he'd smiled at me, the way his voice had changed when I said I was leaving. And the worst part? I couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I hadn't run. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the roof of the tent. The campground was quiet, the only sound the occasional chirp of crickets. But even in the stillness, I couldn't relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, his smile, his outstretched hand. I told myself I was safe, that he was miles away in that cabin, and that there was no way he would come looking for me. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something about him didn't feel right. He hadn't just been some harmless camper. I was sure of that. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the cabin, dark and cold, with the man's face staring at me from the shadows. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, as if I hadn't slept at all. My dreams of the cabin and the man had been so vivid that it took me a moment to remember where I was. The sunlight filtering through the tent's fabric felt too bright, too harsh, and for a split second, I thought I was still trapped in that dark room with him watching me. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the lingering unease. Outside, I could hear the muffled voices of my parents. My dad was fussing over breakfast, probably burning bacon again, and Adam was chattering about some bug he'd found. Their voices were comforting, pulling me back into the familiar rhythm of the campground. But even as I tried to focus on the normalcy of the morning, I couldn't forget the events of the day before. The man's face, his smile, the way his voice had shifted from friendly to sharp. It was all etched into my mind. And now that I'd had time to think about it, one question haunted me. Why was he there? I couldn't get the footprints out of my head either. The cabin had seemed abandoned, like no one had set foot in it for years. Yet those footprints in the dust were proof that someone had been there, someone who wasn't supposed to be, and that someone had tried to keep me there. I decided not to mention anything to my parents. What would I say? That I'd gone into a cabin I shouldn't have and found a creepy man living there? They'd probably ground me for wandering off alone or lecture me about respecting other people's property. Besides, I wasn't even sure if they'd believe me. The whole thing sounded like something out of a ghost story, not something that could actually happen. Instead, I tried to focus on other things. I spent the day riding my bike around the campground, avoiding the trails near the cabin. I hung out with Adam, even though his idea of fun involved poking at bugs and pretending to be a dinosaur. I even helped my mom cook dinner, which earned me a surprised look and a teasing comment about how I must have wanted something. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed a cluster of trees, I felt like there were eyes following me from the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid because of what had happened. But the feeling didn't go away. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat by the dying campfire, staring into the glowing embers. The night was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I tried to tell myself that everything was fine, that the man from the cabin wasn't thinking about me, and that I was safe here, surrounded by my family. But then I heard it, a soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. My head whipped around, and I peered into the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees loomed like black silhouettes, their branches swaying gently. Probably just an animal. I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded shaky even to my own ears. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A soft, deliberate sound, like someone, or something, moving through the underbrush. My heart began to race, and I gripped the edge of my chair, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The night stayed silent, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or a deer passing through. But deep down, I knew better. There was something out there, watching me. I stood up, my legs shaking, and backed toward the tent. My eyes stayed fixed on the trees, half expecting to see the man step out from the shadows, his crooked smile gleaming in the moonlight. But nothing happened. The darkness remained still, as if mocking my fear. The next morning, I told myself I had to find out the truth. I couldn't keep living in fear, jumping at every sound and imagining the man lurking behind every tree. If he really was still out there, I needed to know. After breakfast, I grabbed my bike and told my parents I was going to explore the trails again. My mom reminded me to stay close, and I nodded, forcing a smile. But as soon as I was out of sight, I turned my bike toward the far edge of the campground, the part where the cabin was hidden. The ride felt longer than ever, and with every turn of the pedals, my stomach twisted tighter. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail was empty. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. When I reached the cabin, I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my breath catching in my throat. It looked the same as it had before, old, weathered, and lifeless. The door was shut this time, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything. Maybe the man had been a figment of my imagination, a trick of the shadows and my overactive mind. But then I saw it. Movement in the window. A flash of something pale, like a hand or a face, quickly ducking out of sight. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, my hands gripping the handlebars of my bike. Someone was in there. I wasn't imagining it. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stared at the cabin, my mind racing with questions. Was it the man? Was he watching me now, waiting for me to come closer? Or was it someone else entirely? Finally, I forced myself to move. I stepped off my bike and left it leaning against a tree, my legs trembling as I approached the cabin. I didn't call out this time. I didn't want him to know I was here. Instead, I crept forward, my footsteps silent on the soft earth. When I reached the porch, I hesitated, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The door was shut, but I could feel the weight of someone's presence inside. I swallowed hard and reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. Before I could touch it, the door creaked open, just a crack. My breath caught and I stumbled back, my eyes wide. And then from the darkness inside, I heard his voice. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his tone low and taunting. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding against the ground. When I reached my bike, I jumped on and pedaled away, the trees blurring around me. I didn't stop until I was back at the campsite, gasping for breath and shaking all over. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice, saw the cabin, felt the weight of his gaze. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I needed to tell someone, my parents, the camp staff, anyone who could help. But as I sat in the dark, the words stuck in my throat. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought I was making it up, or worse, that I was just being a kid with an overactive imagination? I lay awake for hours, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, and as the night dragged on, I realized something. The man wasn't just in the cabin. He was watching me, waiting. And no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape him. I didn't know how long I lay awake that night, staring at the tent's ceiling as shadows danced in the dim moonlight. The campground was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made even the slightest sound, a rustling leaf, a distant bird call, seem amplified. My thoughts raced as I tried to figure out what to do next. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. The man from the cabin wasn't just a fleeting encounter. He was here, and even worse, he was watching me. I was sure of it now. The flash of movement at the cabin, his taunting voice. This wasn't my imagination. It was real. But how could I explain that to my parents? What if they didn't believe me? What if they brushed it off, told me it was just some harmless drifter? My heart sank as I realized I might have to face this on my own. The next morning, I decided I'd try to act normal, at least for a little while. If I suddenly started acting paranoid, my parents would definitely start asking questions, and I wasn't ready to explain, at least not yet. Breakfast passed in a blur of scrambled eggs, toast, and Adam's nonstop chatter about wanting to build a tree fort. I nodded along, barely listening as I pushed food around my plate. My mom gave me a few concerned glances, but she didn't say anything. Maybe she thought I was just tired. But as soon as the chance presented itself, I grabbed my bike and told them I was going to ride around the campground. They nodded, distracted by Adam's newest scheme to catch frogs, and I slipped away. I didn't go back to the cabin. Not yet. Instead, I decided to explore the area around it. If the man was living there, maybe I'd find some clues, something that would explain who he was and why he was here. And most importantly, something that would convince my parents that this wasn't just in my head. The trails around the cabin were quieter than I remembered, as if the usual hum of the campground didn't reach this far. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area, their songs fading the closer I got. The air felt heavier here, and the trees loomed closer together, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. As I rode, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man lurking in the shadows. But the trail stayed empty. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my tires. Finally, I came across a small clearing a few hundred yards from the cabin. It wasn't marked on the campground map, and the path leading to it was overgrown, as if no one had used it in years. Curious, I left my bike at the edge of the trail and stepped into the clearing. At first, it looked like any other patch of woods. Tall grass, a few fallen logs, and a scattering of wildflowers. But then I noticed something odd, a small pile of objects near the center of the clearing. As I approached, I realized they weren't random objects. They were items from the campground. A crumpled soda can, a torn piece of a map, a child's toy truck, and even a frayed piece of rope. They were all arranged in a rough circle, as if someone had carefully placed them there. My stomach twisted as I stared at the pile. Who had done this? And why? My eyes scanned the clearing, and that's when I saw it. Footprints in the soft dirt. They weren't mine, and they didn't look fresh. But they were there, leading away from the clearing and deeper into the woods. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to go to my parents and tell them everything. But something about the footprints pulled me forward. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I needed to follow them, to see where they led. The footprints led me to a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. It wound through the trees, twisting and turning until I lost sight of the clearing behind me. The further I walked, the darker it became, the trees pressing in on either side. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, the path opened into another clearing. But this one was different. In the center stood a small wooden shed, its walls covered in moss and its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The shed looked out of place, like it didn't belong here, and yet it felt familiar, like I'd seen it before. My stomach churned as I realized why. It reminded me of the cabin, the same weathered wood, the same feeling of something lurking inside. I approached slowly, my footsteps barely making a sound on the soft ground. The door of the shed was slightly open, just like the cabins had been. And just like before, I felt that same heavy presence, as if someone or something was waiting inside. I peered through the crack in the door, my heart racing. Inside, the shed was dark and cluttered, filled with boxes, old tools, and piles of junk. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On one wall, pinned to the wooden boards with rusty nails, was a map of the campground, and scattered across the map were dozens of red marks, tiny circles drawn around specific spots. One of them was the clearing I'd just come from. Another was the cabin, and one of them was my family's campsite. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would someone mark these places? What did it mean? And then I heard it, a low creak, like the sound of a footstep on wood. My head snapped toward the shed, and my heart nearly stopped. A shadow moved inside, shifting in the dim light. Before I could think, I turned and ran. I sprinted back down the trail, the trees blurring around me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I finally reached my bike, I jumped on and pedaled away, not daring to look back. The campground felt different now. Every shadow and every sound a potential threat. I didn't feel safe anymore. Not here, not anywhere. When I got back to the campsite, I found my parents sitting by the fire, laughing about something Adam had said. The sight of them, so relaxed and carefree, felt surreal after what I'd just seen. I wanted to tell them everything, the cabin, the footprints, the shed, the map. But as I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. How could I explain any of this without sounding crazy? Instead, I sat down by the fire and stared into the flames, my thoughts racing. The man wasn't just some harmless drifter. He had a plan. And whatever it was, it involved me and my family. I had to stop him, but I didn't know how. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees outside, made my heart race. I wanted to believe I was safe here, surrounded by my family. But deep down, I knew better. The man from the cabin wasn't going to stop, and neither was I. The unease stayed with me all night, seeping into my dreams. I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, gasping for air as if I'd been running for hours. Outside, the campground was silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. My tent felt suffocating, but the thought of stepping outside made my stomach churn. I lay there in the darkness, listening for any sound that might confirm my fears. Was the man out there? Was he watching our tent, waiting for the right moment to act? I couldn't let myself fall asleep again. I had to stay alert. By the time morning came, I felt like a zombie. My mom commented on how tired I looked, and my dad joked that I was turning into him, with his love of mid-afternoon naps. I forced a laugh, but the weight of everything I'd discovered was crushing me. My family had no idea what was lurking in the shadows, and I didn't know how to protect them. As we ate breakfast, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. I couldn't fight this alone. "Hey Mom, Dad," I started, my voice trembling. "Have you noticed anything strange around here? Like anyone acting weird?" My mom frowned. "What do you mean, sweetie?" I hesitated, my eyes darting between them. "I mean, like someone who doesn't belong here. Someone who might be, I don't know, watching people." My dad chuckled. "You've been watching too many scary movies." "No," I said quickly, my voice rising. "I'm serious. I saw someone at the cabin in the woods." That caught their attention. My mom put down her fork, her face turning serious. "What cabin?" I explained everything. The cabin, the man, the footprints, the map in the shed. By the time I finished, my parents were staring at me like I just told them the world was ending. "You went into an abandoned cabin?" my dad said, his voice sharp. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" "That's not the point," I snapped. "There's someone out there and he's watching us. He marked our campsite on a map. I saw it." My mom exchanged a worried glance with my dad. "Maybe we should talk to the campground staff," she said. "Yes," I said, relieved they were finally taking me seriously. "We have to do something." We headed to the campground office right after breakfast. The staff there listened to our story, their faces growing more concerned with every word. They promised to send someone to check out the cabin and the shed and said they'd keep an eye out for anyone acting suspicious. But as we walked back to our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The man wasn't going to stop just because the staff was looking for him. He'd already proven he was good at staying hidden. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, my ears straining for any sound. My parents had tried to reassure me, saying the staff would take care of it, but I couldn't relax. Not until I knew my family was safe. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a faint rustling in the trees. My heart jumped into my throat as I grabbed the flashlight my dad had left by the fire. I stood up, my legs trembling, and pointed the beam into the woods. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. For a moment there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the crackle of the dying fire. But then, I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. It was him, the man from the cabin. My blood turned to ice as I stared at him. He was tall and thin, his clothes ragged and dirty. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see the glint of his eyes as he watched me. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Leave us alone!" He didn't move. He just stood there staring at me like he was waiting for something. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I had to wake my parents. I had to get help. But as I turned to run, I heard his voice. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, his tone calm and almost soothing. "You should have stayed away." I burst into the tent, shaking my parents awake. "He's here!" I shouted. "The man from the cabin, he's here!" My dad shot up, grabbing the flashlight and a pocket knife he kept in the tent. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "Lock the tent." "No," I said. "We need to get out of here." But my dad was already stepping outside, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. My mom grabbed me and Adam, pulling us close as we huddled in the corner of the tent. My little brother was wide-eyed and silent, his usual chatter replaced by fear. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Then we heard my dad shout, "Hey, what are you doing?" There was a loud crash, followed by the sound of running footsteps. My mom clutched us tighter, her breathing ragged, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. When my dad returned, his face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "He's gone," he said. But he was watching us from the woods. I chased him off. "We need to leave," my mom said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here." My dad nodded. "Pack everything. We're leaving now." We scrambled to gather our things, stuffing them into bags and throwing them into the car. The campground, once so peaceful, now felt suffocating, every shadow and rustle a reminder of the man who had been watching us. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back. The woods were dark and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, hiding in the shadows, watching us leave. The ride home was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. I wanted to believe it was over, that we were safe now. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The man from the cabin wasn't just some drifter. He had a plan, and I had a feeling we hadn't seen the last of him. As we pulled into our driveway, my mom turned to me, her face pale but determined. "We're calling the police," she said. "We need to report this." I nodded, my hands trembling in my lap. I didn't know what the man wanted or why he had targeted us, But one thing was clear: we couldn't face this alone. The police came the next day, taking our statements and promising to investigate. They said they'd send someone to the campground to look for the man and check the cabin and shed. But their reassurances did little to ease my fear. For weeks, I jumped at every sound, every shadow. I couldn't sleep without the lights on, and even then I had nightmares about the man standing in the woods, watching me. My parents tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in their eyes too. We all knew that, until the man was caught, we wouldn't truly be safe. Months passed and the police never found him. The cabin was abandoned, just as I'd first thought, and the shed was empty by the time they got there. Whoever the man was, he had vanished without a trace. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel like he's out there, watching, waiting. And I know that no matter how far I run, I'll never forget the way his eyes glinted in the darkness, or the sound of his voice as he said, "I knew you'd come back." It had been 6 months since we left the campground. 6 months of living in the shadow of that man from the cabin. My family had tried to move on, to find some sense of normalcy again, but there was always that lingering feeling that something wasn't quite right. Every time I heard the wind howl or the trees sway outside, I'd freeze, my heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't forget his face, his voice, the way he'd seemed so sure of himself, as if he'd been waiting for me to find him. The police had closed their investigation, saying they'd exhausted all leads. They assured us the man was long gone, that there was nothing to worry about. But something inside me refused to believe them. Something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, still watching. It was late one evening, a few weeks after our return home, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. I had been scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself, when I came across an article on the local news website. The headline was innocuous enough: "Missing person found in abandoned cabin." But when I clicked on it, my stomach dropped. The article described the discovery of a body found in a cabin just a few miles outside of the same campground we had visited. The body had been decomposing for weeks, and there was no sign of foul play. Just a man, alone, dead in a dilapidated cabin. The photo accompanying the article stopped me cold. The cabin from the article matched the one I had seen, and the man, he looked familiar, but I couldn't place it at first. Then it hit me. It was him. The man I'd seen. The one who had stalked us, taunted us, and watched from the shadows. It was his body. I couldn't understand it. How could he be dead? How could the man who had haunted our every step be gone? Yet I still felt like he was watching me. And what about all those marks on the map? Had he been keeping track of others too? Was I just one of many? I couldn't let it go. I needed to know more. I called my mom and told her about the article. She didn't say much at first, but I could tell she was concerned. The last thing she wanted was for me to dig back into it. "You don't need to know everything," she said, her voice trembling. "It's over. It's done." But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. A few days later, I drove out to the old campground. I didn't tell my parents where I was going. This was something I needed to do alone. I had to see the cabin for myself. I needed to know why I still felt so uneasy, so restless. Maybe it was because the police hadn't told us everything. Maybe they had missed something. But I knew the truth. My gut had been right all along. As I pulled up to the entrance, everything looked almost the same. The gates were locked, the roads empty. It was as if the whole place had been abandoned. I parked by the entrance, the old sign swaying gently in the breeze. The campground that had once been full of families, laughter, and campfires was now eerily quiet, with only the sound of rustling leaves to fill the silence. I walked down the familiar trail, my footsteps light on the gravel as I made my way toward the cabin. The closer I got, the more tense I felt. My pulse quickened, and the air seemed to grow colder, even though it was a warm afternoon. When I reached the cabin, the door was wide open, just like I remembered it. I stepped inside, the creaking of the floorboards under my feet the only sound breaking the silence. The dust hung thick in the air, and the smell of mildew and decay was overpowering. I looked around, half expecting to see him standing there, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. But the place was empty, abandoned just as it had been when I first discovered it. Then, something caught my eye. On the far wall, behind a shelf, was a large wooden chest. It wasn't there the last time I'd visited. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing in my chest. As I opened the lid, my breath caught in my throat. Inside there were papers, old maps, photographs, and other objects that seemed oddly familiar. As I sifted through them, I realized they were all linked to the campground. One map had a circled area, our campsite, and underneath the map was a journal, its pages yellowed and worn with age. I opened the journal and began to read, the words scrawled in uneven handwriting. It became clear to me that the man who had stalked us wasn't some random drifter. He had been living here for years, hiding in plain sight, marking every visitor who came through. He had known our campsite before we even arrived, and now, in his twisted obsession, he had kept records of everything, every camper, every moment of contact, everything. But the final page stopped me cold. It was written in bold, frantic letters. The hunt is almost over. Only one remains. It won't be long now. A shiver ran down my spine as I slammed the journal shut. The man hadn't been stalking us just for fun. He had been tracking us for a reason. He had been watching me. And the last entry, it was clear. It wasn't over. I wasn't just a witness in his twisted game. I was the final target. Panic surged through me, and I ran out of the cabin, not daring to look back. My mind raced as I ran down the trail toward my car. I didn't know what the man had planned, but I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't keep running from him. This had to end now. I drove straight to the police station, heart pounding as I ran inside. I found the officer who had worked on our case and pushed the journal into his hands. "You need to look at this," I said, voice shaking. "You need to understand. It's not over. He was planning something." The officer flipped through the journal quickly, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up at me. "We'll investigate," he said, his tone grave. "Thank you for bringing this in." It was the last thing I could do. I had finally given the police the evidence they needed, and I had to trust they'd handle it from there. Weeks passed, and I tried to return to some sense of normal life. The police kept us updated, but they never found anything that led them to the man. The case slowly faded from the news. The campground remained closed, a reminder of the terror we'd left behind. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The man might be dead, but his presence, his obsession, lingered in my mind. He had left a mark on me, something that no police investigation or closing of the case could erase. And so, with a heavy heart, I closed this chapter of my life. I couldn't change what had happened, and no matter how many times I told myself it was over, there would always be that question in the back of my mind. Was it truly the end? Because there was one thing I knew for sure. The man had been waiting for me all along. He had seen me before I even knew he existed. And somehow, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he would never truly be gone. Maybe, just maybe, he had been watching me the whole time. Hi there, my name's Theo, and I live in a quiet little town called Hollow Woods. Nothing exciting ever happens here. I like reading scary books, playing with my dog, Buddy, and riding my bike down the long, winding roads near my house. But one night, something so strange happened that it still gives me chills when I think about it. It all started on a cool autumn evening. The sun had set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. I decided to take Buddy out for a walk. Buddy is a big, fluffy dog with golden fur and a nose that's always sniffing around for trouble. He's usually very calm, but that night he was acting strange. His ears were up, and he kept tugging at the leash like he wanted to run back home. I should have listened to him. We were walking down bare Cedar Lane, a narrow path surrounded by tall, dark trees. The streetlights flickered every now and then, casting long shadows on the ground. I had my flashlight with me, but it wasn't very bright. Still, I wasn't scared. Hollow Woods was safe, or so I thought. As we walked, I heard a rustling sound in the bushes. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing there. Probably just a squirrel, I told myself. But Buddy let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on something ahead. I followed his gaze and saw nothing, just the empty path stretching into the darkness. We kept walking, but Buddy was still uneasy. He kept looking back, his tail tucked between his legs. That's when I felt it, a strange, cold breeze, even though there was no wind. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept moving, trying to shake off the creepy feeling. Then, out of nowhere, someone stepped out from behind a tree. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie and carrying a backpack. I couldn't see his face because he kept his head down, but I could tell he was watching me. My heart started pounding in my chest. I thought about turning around and running, but my feet felt glued to the ground. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for something. Suddenly, he pulled out a small can and sprayed something in my direction. It hit my face, and my eyes started burning. I dropped Buddy's leash and stumbled backward trying to wipe my face, but it only made things worse. My throat felt tight, and I couldn't breathe properly. I heard Buddy barking wildly, but I couldn't see him anymore. Everything was blurry, and my head was spinning. I managed to pull out my phone and call for help, but my fingers were shaking so much that I dropped it. I knew I had to get back home. I felt around for the sidewalk and started crawling. Every step was painful, and I could barely keep my eyes open. Somehow I made it to my front door, but my keys were nowhere to be found. I was panicking now, gasping for air, pounding on the door with all the strength I had left. Then, the door creaked open, and I saw Mrs. Marlowe, my neighbor. She's an older lady who lives alone with her cat, Whiskers. I had never really talked to her before, but I was so grateful she was there. "Oh dear," she gasped when she saw me. Come in, come in." I stumbled inside, and she guided me to her bathroom. I splashed water on my face, hoping it would help. The burning slowly started to fade, but my eyes were still stinging. Mrs. Marlowe called the police while I sat on the bathroom floor, trying to catch my breath. The police arrived a few minutes later. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. They asked me a lot of questions, but I couldn't give them much information. I never saw the man's face, and he didn't say a word. He just disappeared. The police told me it might have been a random attack, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for me that night, waiting in the shadows, watching. Mrs. Marlowe made me some hot tea and let me sit on her couch until I felt better. Buddy came running back an hour later, unharmed but clearly shaken. He curled up next to me, resting his head on my lap, as if to say, "It's okay now." I never saw the man again, but I always feel like someone is watching when I walk down Cedar Lane. Maybe it's just my imagination, or maybe, just maybe, he's still out there waiting for the right moment. And that's why you should always trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, listen to it. Because sometimes the scariest things aren't the monsters in books or the ghosts in stories. They're the ones hiding in plain sight. Good night, and remember to stay safe. You never know who or what might be lurking in the shadows. Hey there, kids. I'm What Milo. And I have a story to tell you that still gives me goosebumps whenever I think about it. This happened last year when I was a junior in high school. Our school, Pinewood High, is pretty normal. Nothing crazy ever happens there. Well, at least that's what I thought until one unforgettable day. Let me tell you about this kid in my forensics class. His name was Zeke. Zeke was different. He never really talked to anyone, and when he did, it was usually something sarcastic or rude. He always sat in the back corner of the classroom, staring at his notebook, but I never saw him write anything in it. He had this look on his face like he was mad at the world. Everyone kind of stayed away from Zeke. He didn't join in when we worked on group projects, and he never smiled. People whispered about him in the hallways, saying he was the kind of kid you didn't want to mess with. But to be honest, I think he was just lonely. He always looked like he had a lot on his mind. One morning, something strange happened. Zeke walked into class without his usual black backpack. He sat in a different seat, closer to the door. Our teacher, Mr. Oliver, who used to be a police officer, didn't seem to notice. After taking attendance, Mr. Oliver left the room to grab something from the classroom next door. While Mr. Oliver was gone, Zeke got up and walked out without saying a word. We all just sat there, confused. When Mr. Oliver came back, he didn't even realize Zeke was gone. I didn't think much about it and went on with my day. My next class was chemistry, and we were just starting an experiment when the school intercom crackled to life. Attention, students and staff. We are now in a code red lockdown. This is not a drill. My heart sank. A code red meant we had to hide immediately because there was a serious danger, like someone with a weapon. Our teacher, Mrs. Lynn, quickly told us to get into the storage room where they kept all the chemicals. It was cramped and smelled weird, but we didn't care. We were all scared. We sat in the dark, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was going on. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my mom. "Are you okay? What's happening?" "I don't know," I texted back. "We're in lockdown." Minutes felt like hours. We were stuck in that tiny room for what seemed like forever. Every little sound made us jump. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the intercom announced, "Code green. The lockdown is over. Please resume your regular schedule." When we got back to class the next day, everyone was talking about what had happened. That's when Mr. Oliver told us the truth. Zeke had left school during first period, walked to a gas station down the street, and robbed it. But it gets even creepier. Zeke was wearing a PA clown mask when he did it. Yeah, a clown mask. This was back when people were dressing up as clowns and scaring people for fun. But Zeke wasn't playing around. He had a real gun. After robbing the gas station, Zeke tried to hide in the woods behind our school. The police found him there and arrested him. They said he ditched his backpack in the woods so he could sneak back into school without looking suspicious. The scariest part? Zeke had that gun on him the whole time he was sitting in our class. If someone had said the wrong thing to him, who knows what could have happened? I still think about Zeke sometimes. I don't know what he was going through, but I hope he gets the help he needs. And I learned something important that day. You never really know what someone else is dealing with. So, if you ever feel like something is off or someone needs help, don't ignore it. Trust your gut and tell someone you trust. And remember, always be kind. You never know what battles other people are fighting. Good night, and stay safe. You never know what kind of story you might be a part of next. When I used to work in a candy shop. I know candy shops sound like happy places, but this story, well, it's not like that. It's a little scary. It all started when I moved to a big city called Riverstone. My family and I had just come from far away, from a small village in Eastfield. Life in Riverstone was tough at first. We lived in a tiny apartment in a busy part of the city. It was noisy, and the streets were always filled with people rushing around. My wife Sadia and I worked hard. She sewed clothes at home and I had two jobs, one driving a cab and the other working at Sam's Sweet Shop, a small candy store at the corner of Maple Street. The candy shop was cozy, filled with jars of bright, colorful sweets. Kids would come in with their parents, their faces lighting up when they saw all the treats. I loved seeing their smiles. But one afternoon, something happened that I'll never forget. It was a quiet day at the shop. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as I stood behind the counter, waiting for the next customer. The sun was shining through the big glass window, casting long shadows on the floor. Everything seemed normal until the doorbell jingled. A man walked in. He was tall and wearing all black. A hoodie covered his head, and he had sunglasses on, even though it wasn't sunny inside. His face was hidden behind a mask. Right away, I knew something was wrong. My heart started beating faster. "Hey," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Looking for something sweet today?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a small, shiny gun. My hands felt cold and I couldn't move. He pointed the gun at me and shouted, "Open the register, now!" I froze. My mind went blank. I wanted to open the register, but my fingers wouldn't work. They felt like they were stuck. The man grew angrier. His voice was loud and sharp. "Do it! Open it or I'll shoot!" he yelled. I finally managed to press the buttons, but the register wouldn't open. I could feel the sweat on my forehead. The man stepped closer, and then he said something terrible. He called me a name, something hateful. It hurt more than the fear I felt at that moment. Then it happened. The gun went off. I ducked, turning my head just in time. The bullet grazed my cheek, leaving a sharp, burning pain. I fell to the floor, clutching my face. The man didn't care. He grabbed the register, smashed it on the ground, and scooped up the money. Then he ran out of the shop, disappearing into the streets. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard voices, people rushing in. Neighbors who had heard the gunshot came to help. One woman, Mrs. Green, knelt beside me. "Don't move," she said. "Help is on the way." I could barely talk. The pain in my cheek was sharp, and I was still in shock. But I was grateful to be alive. The ambulance arrived quickly. The paramedics lifted me onto a stretcher, and soon I was on my way to the hospital. The doctors treated my wound, and I had to stay in the hospital for 2 days. My family came to see me, their faces full of worry and relief. When the police arrived, they asked me questions. I told them everything I could, but I didn't know what the man looked like under all those layers. He had hidden himself well. Even though they searched, the man was never found. It was scary to think he was still out there, but I was just thankful I was okay. After that day, I learned an important lesson. When someone is in danger or facing something scary, the most important thing is to stay calm and do what you can to stay safe. No amount of money or things is worth risking your life. So remember, kids, if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone is threatening you, listen to the adults around you. Stay calm and keep yourself safe. That's the most important thing. Now, every time I see a candy store, I think about that day. But I also think about how lucky I am to be here, telling you this story. Stay safe and be kind to each other. You never know what someone else is going through. It was the kind of night that made you appreciate the quiet, the solitude, and the absence of the hustle and bustle of daily life. The city lights flickered in the distance as I made my way out of the hospital parking lot. The world outside seemed to be slowing down, but my shift had just ended. I worked as a night nurse in the emergency room, and while the work was never predictable, tonight had been relatively calm. That calmness, though, always felt strange after hours of non-stop activity. After so many critical cases and constant motion, it was hard to shift gears when the clock finally struck 11 p.m., signaling the end of my shift. Most people are in bed by the time my workday ends, but for me, it was just the start of the journey home. The drive was long, About 25 minutes, but I had gotten used to it over the past few years. The road between the hospital and my home was mostly empty this time of night, and I liked it that way. No distractions, no other cars, just me, the open road, and the rhythm of the engine humming beneath me. The drive had become routine. I had learned to find comfort in the familiar way the road twisted and turned, how the streetlights flickered past, and how the houses became more spaced out as I drove further away from the city. The highway was my usual route, the quickest and easiest way home. It was a straight shot, but even then it took some time. The surrounding countryside wasn't exactly teeming with activity at this hour, and the only noise was the occasional rumble of a truck passing by in the opposite direction. But tonight was different. I left work a little later than usual. I had spent an extra half hour completing paperwork and taking care of a few administrative tasks that had piled up during my shift. I felt the exhaustion in my bones, the weight of an entire day's worth of patients, urgent cases, and constant movement. All I wanted was to get home, kick off my shoes, and relax in front of the TV with some dinner. As I pulled onto the highway, I let out a sigh of relief. The silence was comforting, almost welcoming. The steady hum of the tires against the asphalt felt like a lullaby, and I could already feel my mind beginning to drift away from the stresses of the day. The headlights of my car illuminated the road ahead, casting long shadows on the empty fields beside me. It was peaceful. But then, as I neared the halfway point of my drive, something strange caught my attention. At first, it was subtle. I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror growing larger, as if someone was approaching fast. The sound of another car's engine reached my ears, and for a moment I didn't think much of it. After all, it was a highway, and even though it was late, there was always the possibility of someone else driving through. But then the car behind me began to close the distance faster than I would have expected. I glanced in my mirror, and to my surprise I saw a car speeding toward me, its headlights blinding in the darkness. I frowned, watching as it grew closer. The car swerved, almost like it was trying to avoid something in its path, before it shot past me in a blur of motion. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I instinctively slowed down, surprised by the speed at which the car had passed. The car didn't just pass me. It zoomed by at what seemed like an impossibly high speed. My eyes followed the vehicle as it continued down the highway, its lights becoming smaller in the distance. The car was now a dark shape moving quickly, its engine roaring with power as it hurtled ahead. I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. I hadn't seen many cars on this road at night, especially not at this hour, and it was strange to see one traveling so fast. My mind began to race. It wasn't like people were generally in a hurry to get anywhere on this stretch of highway. The road was dark, with no real reason to speed unless there was something seriously urgent going on. I tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe the driver had somewhere to be, or maybe they just liked driving fast. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The car was swerving. At first it was just a small drift into the other lane, nothing too alarming, but then it happened again, more severe this time. The car lurched across the lane, nearly veering off the road. I could see the headlights flicker and the car fishtailing slightly, as though the driver was losing control. It wasn't just speeding, it was erratic. The car bounced between the lanes, wobbling like it was struggling to stay straight. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and my mind began to race. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just speeding anymore. It was as if the driver had lost control, but they were still pushing the car faster and faster. I glanced around, looking for any sign of another car coming in the opposite direction. There was none. Just the vast emptiness of the highway stretching out before us. I knew I needed to keep my distance. As much as I wanted to make sure everything was okay, I didn't want to get too close. The last thing I wanted was to get involved in whatever was happening. Still, curiosity got the best of me. I couldn't help but watch as the car's behavior grew more and more unpredictable. The car would speed up, then suddenly slow down, only to accelerate again, revving the engine so hard I could hear the growl of the exhaust from where I was. It was erratic, dangerous, and completely out of control. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening. My first thought was that the driver might be drunk. The erratic movements, the sudden changes in speed, it all pointed to someone who was possibly intoxicated. I knew I had to stay alert. I couldn't let myself get too close, but I also couldn't let them get away. I tried to keep a safe distance, staying a few car lengths behind. I couldn't afford to get too close in case the driver made any sudden moves. But as much as I tried to stay back, the car in front of me kept swerving, and I couldn't take my eyes off of it. And then, it happened. As the car swerved once again, something caught my eye. A faint, barely visible shape in the back seat. For a moment, I couldn't tell what I was seeing. But then the headlights of my car illuminated the figure, and my heart skipped a beat. There was someone in the back seat. A woman. Her head bobbed with each violent swerve, and I could see her struggling, her body moving erratically as the car jerked back and forth. But it wasn't just that. It was the way she moved. Or rather, the way she didn't move. Her body seemed limp, as if she wasn't able to hold herself up. That's when I saw it. The man in the front seat had a weapon, a blunt object. He swung it down over and over again, striking her with violent force. I could barely make out the details, but I didn't need to see more. I knew what was happening. The man was beating her. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I felt a wave of sickness wash over me. I was in shock, but at the same time I knew I couldn't just keep driving. I had to do something. Without thinking, I reached for my phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking, but I tried to steady myself as I spoke. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end answered, sharp and professional. There's a car on Highway 6 heading south, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The driver is hurting someone. A woman, in the back seat. You need to stop him. I think she's in trouble. The dispatcher's voice grew urgent. Stay on the line. We're dispatching officers now. Please do not follow the vehicle. I can't just stop. I have to follow him. I have to make sure they find him. I nearly shouted, my heart racing. The dispatcher warned me again not to follow, but I was already too deep into it. I couldn't just let him get away. I pressed the phone to my ear as I kept my eyes locked on the swerving car. Something in my gut told me that the woman's life depended on me being there. I couldn't just let this pass by. I stayed behind the car for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep following, but I had to. I had to make sure this man didn't hurt anyone else. And then it happened again. The car sped up, its engine roaring as it zoomed past. My heart raced as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The car in front of me, this out-of-control, speeding maniac, was now accelerating, darting through the empty highway at a pace I couldn't keep up with. The headlights of my own car illuminated the road ahead, but it felt like the distance between us was only growing wider with every passing second. I couldn't let him escape. The dispatcher's voice echoed in my head, a constant reminder of the advice I had just received. Do not follow the vehicle. I knew they had sent police units, but every second I waited felt like an eternity. Every moment I hesitated. That woman in the back seat could be suffering more than I had already witnessed. I couldn't let this man get away. He had to be stopped. But as I pressed my foot harder onto the gas pedal, I knew I was taking a risk. I was driving faster than I should, risking my own safety to make sure that whatever nightmare was unfolding in that car wouldn't continue. My mind was a whirlwind of fear, anger, and determination, all swirling together in a chaotic mixture that made it hard to think clearly. The man in the other car had already swerved across 2 lanes. His car was unstable, shaky, and yet he still kept pushing it forward, accelerating into the night. His reckless driving sent a shiver down my spine. I was certain he was intoxicated, probably beyond comprehension, judging by how erratic his movements were. No one drives like that unless they are impaired, I thought, my thoughts quickly spiraling into a haze of dread. He didn't seem to care about the risk. His desperation, if that's what it was terrifying. The woman in the back seat had barely moved since I first noticed her, and my stomach turned in knots. I couldn't stop imagining what she might be going through. How badly was she hurt? What if she was too weak to fight back, too scared to scream? I had to get help to her. The highway stretched ahead like an endless path in the dark. I could barely see anything but the faint glow of my headlights and the glow of the taillights in front of me. I didn't know how much longer I could follow him before he lost me, or worse, before something catastrophic happened. I didn't know what was driving me in that moment, whether it was my own fear for the woman's life or the sense that if I didn't stay with him, I'd never forgive myself. But I kept my foot pressed down. Every bump in the road jolted me, and my nerves were frayed, but I couldn't let up. Then I saw it, the flashing lights. Bright red and blue lights blinked into my rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, I felt a rush of relief flood through me. The police had arrived. They were finally here. I slowed slightly, allowing the police cars to catch up to the speeding vehicle ahead. My heart pounded in my chest, louder than the sound of the engines. I could see the sirens lighting up the night, casting strange, eerie shadows over the highway. My eyes never left the swerving car ahead, which was now trying to dodge the lights in a desperate attempt to flee. The moment the police cars reached the speeding vehicle, everything happened in a blur. The man slammed on the gas, pushing his car even harder, as if the flashing lights only fueled his panic. The tires screeched as he weaved through the lanes, cutting across the road in an attempt to break free. The police officers weren't far behind, their sirens wailing louder, and their headlights flashing in sync with the chaos. I kept a safe distance, but my eyes stayed locked on the scene, knowing this was the most crucial moment of all. It all unfolded in the blink of an eye. The man suddenly swerved to the side of the highway, as if he had made up his mind that he was going off the road entirely. My stomach dropped as I saw the car head straight for the grass field that bordered the highway. The tires screeched as the vehicle skidded across the asphalt, and then it veered wildly into the open field. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. He wasn't stopping. He was going full speed. The car crashed through the fence that separated the highway from the field, its tires kicking up dirt and debris as it barreled across the uneven terrain. I could hear the engine straining under the pressure, and then, for a brief moment, there was silence. It didn't last long. The car flipped. The screech of metal against earth filled the night air as the car lost control completely, spinning in circles as it rolled over and over. I could see the headlights turn in impossible directions, the car flipping several times before finally landing upside down in the middle of the field, a crumpled mess of metal and shattered glass. For a moment, I thought the world had gone still. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. The police cars pulled up quickly, their tires screeching as they stopped beside the wreck. Without hesitating, the officers jumped out of their vehicles, rushing toward the overturned car. My hands were shaking as I pulled over to the shoulder, stopping my car at a safe distance. I could hardly bring myself to move, my legs frozen in place as I stared at the wreckage. My mind was racing. Was the woman in the car still alive? Had the crash been enough to finally stop the man? Was she going to be okay? I didn't have the answers, but the police were moving quickly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they worked to get to the car. I couldn't see much from where I was parked, but I could tell the officers weren't wasting any time. They were trained for situations like this, and I had to trust that they knew what they were doing. A few minutes later, one of the officers pulled the door open and immediately went to the back seat. I watched with bated breath, unable to look away, as the officer carefully pulled the woman out of the car. Her face was battered and bruised, her clothes torn and dirty. She didn't move much, her body limp in the officer's arms. "Stay with her. Stay with her," I muttered under my breath, my hands clenched tightly into fists. My mind couldn't settle. The fear that she might be too far gone gnawed at me, but there was no way to know for sure. Then, the officer on the driver's side of the car pulled out the man. He was stumbling, trying to get away, but his movements were sluggish, his arms hanging at his sides. He was drunk, out of control, and yet somehow he had managed to survive the crash without injury. The officers didn't waste any time. One of them pulled out a taser, and without hesitation, zapped the man in the chest. He fell to the ground, convulsing for a few moments before he went still. They cuffed him quickly, securing him on the ground, and then they began to attend to the woman in the back seat. I could see them talking to her, trying to reassure her. One of the officers gave me a brief look, and I could see the gratitude in his eyes. He nodded as if to say thank you, but I wasn't sure if he realized how much I had been involved in this. I wasn't sure how much they knew about my role in keeping an eye on the car, but I didn't care. I was just relieved that someone had finally been able to help her. A few minutes later, an ambulance pulled up, and paramedics rushed to her side. I saw them working on her, checking for injuries, and I prayed that she would be okay. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing her, and how close I had come to losing everything. The officers eventually approached me, and one of them, a tall man with short cropped hair, nodded as he spoke. "Thank you for your help," he said, his voice sincere. "You did the right thing by calling us in. We wouldn't have known about this situation without you." I nodded, still in shock, unable to speak. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. I couldn't process it all yet, but I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The woman was alive, and the man was in custody. Justice would be served, and I had played a small role in that. As the ambulance drove off with the woman, I sat there for a few moments longer, trying to collect myself. The night had changed in ways I never could have imagined when I first left work. I had driven home with no idea that my path would cross with such a nightmare. But in the end, I had done something right. I had followed my gut, and it had made all the difference. But as I started the engine and prepared to leave, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if I had gotten there too late? What if I hadn't followed? What if everything had turned out differently? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. There would be time to reflect later. For now, I needed to get home. The drive home was quieter than it should have been. The usual hum of my car's engine, the distant rumble of the tires against the road. Everything seemed so normal, so mundane after what had just happened. But despite the normalcy, my mind was anything but at ease. I kept replaying the events of the night over and over, each detail so vivid, as if they were happening again in real time. The woman's face, battered, bruised, barely conscious, haunted me. The man, grinning like a madman before the crash, kept appearing in my thoughts, his eyes wild with terror, or maybe something darker, something more unsettling. Why had he done it? What had driven him to such violence? And who was she? The questions swirled endlessly in my mind, each one more unanswered than the last. I wasn't sure if I wanted the answers, or if I was better off not knowing. But the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that my involvement didn't end with calling the police. I couldn't just move on, go back to my normal life, and forget about her. I had done my part, maybe more than I should have, but there was still this nagging feeling that I needed to know more, that something deeper was going on, something I hadn't seen. As I drove, my headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet in front of me. The long, empty road stretched ahead, the black pavement glistening from a light rain that had fallen earlier. It was the kind of night where every turn felt like an eternity. Every stretch of road seemed endless. It was only about a 20-minute drive home from the scene, but tonight it felt like hours. I glanced at my phone, the screen lighting up in the dark cabin of my car. There was a message from a coworker, someone who had been working the shift with me that night. She was asking if I was okay, if I needed anything after the crazy night. I quickly typed out a reply. "Yeah, just trying to process everything. I'll be okay." It was a lie, but what could I say? I had no idea what to say. As I entered the quiet residential area near my home, I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the headlights of my car. The air outside felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. I couldn't tell if it was the tension still lingering in my body or something more. An instinct, maybe, that told me to be cautious, that something wasn't quite over yet. I shook my head, forcing myself to push the thoughts aside. It had been a long night. I needed to get some sleep. I had to try to put it all out of my mind, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned in bed, my body exhausted but my mind racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face again. The blood, the bruises, the fear in her eyes. And then there was the man's face, twisted with something I couldn't quite decipher. What had he been thinking? What kind of person could do something like that? I finally gave up trying to sleep. My mind was too frantic, too unsettled. Instead, I reached for my phone and started scrolling through the news, hoping for some distraction. But nothing about the incident had made it to the local news yet. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. The lack of information felt strange. If something this serious had happened, I figured it would have made the headlines by now. But the only thing I found was a brief mention of a crash on Highway 46. No details, no mention of the people involved, just a line about an accident in the area. It didn't sit right with me. I stared at the screen for a while longer, wondering if I should call the police, ask them for an update. Maybe there was more I should know. But then, just as quickly as the thought came, I dismissed it. I wasn't part of the investigation. I had done my part. But still, the questions gnawed at me. Around 3 a.m., I finally gave in and forced myself to sleep. But it wasn't peaceful. The dreams came quickly, strange and fragmented. I dreamt of the highway, the car barreling out of control, the woman's cries, the screeching of tires. It felt like I was reliving the entire thing, but in a twisted, distorted way that made it even worse. When I woke up, I felt drained, like I hadn't slept at all. My mind was still heavy with the night's events, but I had to push it aside. I had work to do, another shift at the hospital, another day to get through. I couldn't afford to be distracted, but even as I got ready for the day, my mind kept wandering back to the woman. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I had to know she was okay. I had to make sure she was all right. So, I did something I hadn't planned on. I called the police. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Maybe some reassurance that she was safe, that she had made it through the night. But when I called the station, the voice on the other end was cold, impersonal. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give you any updates on the case. It's still under investigation," the officer told me. "We appreciate your assistance, but at this time, we can't provide any further details." I felt a pang of frustration. I had done everything I could. I had stayed with the situation. I had called them. I had followed the car. And now I couldn't even get any information. It didn't seem fair. I felt like I deserved more than this, like I should have some closure. Still, I thanked the officer and hung up the phone. It wasn't their fault, but it didn't make me feel any better. I tried to focus on my work. I really did. But the whole day felt like I was on autopilot, just going through the motions. My coworkers noticed my distraction, but I didn't know how to explain it to them. How could I tell them that my thoughts kept drifting back to a woman I barely knew, who I had seen for mere moments, but whose image had burned itself into my memory? I found myself pacing the halls, avoiding the break room, staying busy with whatever I could do to keep my mind off the night. It wasn't easy, and every now and then, I would catch myself staring at a coworker, wondering if they knew something I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. When the day ended, I walked to my car, feeling the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on me. The quiet streets outside the hospital were calming, but my thoughts were still unsettled. I didn't want to go home yet. There was a part of me that still felt like I needed answers, answers that no one was willing to give me. I started driving, not sure where I was headed. Maybe I was just trying to clear my head. Maybe I was looking for some sign, something that would tell me I wasn't just imagining things. As I drove down the familiar roads, I turned onto the highway once more, the same stretch of road where everything had unfolded. I didn't know why I was back here. There was no reason to be. But something about the place, about the events of that night, kept pulling me in. I drove for a few miles, my eyes scanning the landscape, half expecting to see the wreckage, or the flashing lights, or even the officers still working at the scene. But the highway was as empty as it always was. The crash was long gone, cleaned up, forgotten by most. And then I saw it. It wasn't much. A small handwritten sign posted near the shoulder of the road, but it caught my attention. Something about it felt wrong. I slowed down, my heart rate picking up again, and pulled over to the side. I stopped my car and got out, walking toward the sign. It was simple, just a piece of cardboard with a message written in marker. Thank you for helping her. My breath caught in my throat. There was no explanation, no further detail, but the words seemed to pull me in, as though they had been meant just for me. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there staring at the sign. How did they know I had helped? Who had written it? I looked around, but the road was empty. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet that sign, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like a message. I stood there for a few moments longer, my mind spinning with questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled upon something much bigger than I had ever imagined. The sign seemed to linger in front of me, its simple message a strange weight on my chest. Thank you for helping her. I could barely breathe. Every fiber of my being screamed that I shouldn't linger here any longer, that I should get back in my car and drive away as quickly as possible. But I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that sign. Who had written it? How did they know I was the one who had helped the woman? Was this just a coincidence? The air around me felt thick, suffocating even, as if the whole night had suddenly intensified. The road, the trees, the quiet landscape, it all seemed darker now. The lights of my car flickered slightly as if even the vehicle sensed something was wrong. My feet felt like they were glued to the pavement as I stood there, staring at the sign. It had to mean something. But what? I looked around nervously, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows and grab me. But the area was empty, as desolate as it had always been. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind and the distant hum of traffic from the nearby highway. I reached out slowly, trembling, and tore the sign down, rolling it up and slipping it into the back seat of my car. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands clammy as I returned to the driver's seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, but the road behind me remained silent and still. It wasn't much, just a sign, just a piece of cardboard with a message. And yet it felt like a turning point, like I had been pulled into something that I wasn't prepared for. I started the engine, the familiar hum of my car somehow comforting now that I was moving. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I turned the car around, heading back the way I had come. But I wasn't sure where I was going. Was this the end of the story? Should I forget about it and move on? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't. Not now. Not after what I had seen. The man, the woman, the crash. It didn't feel finished. Not by a long shot. As I drove, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. The roads were still empty. The stretch of highway as quiet as it had been before. But something felt off, like I wasn't alone, even if I was. And then my phone buzzed. I glanced down at it, not wanting to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. It was a message from my coworker again. Hey, I'm sorry about what happened last night. Are you okay? I heard something about the case. They're still investigating it, but I thought you might want to know. Still investigating? I sat up straighter in the seat, my pulse quickening. Why had they told her that? She was just a coworker, not a police officer. How had she gotten that information? I pulled over to the side of the road and quickly typed out a reply. "What do you mean? What did you hear?" The response came almost immediately. "They're saying the guy was part of some group. Something bigger. He wasn't just some random guy who got drunk and lost control. It was all planned. They found a lot of strange things in his car when they arrested him. Weapons, and a bunch of paperwork with weird names on it. It's a mess." I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. A group? Weapons? This was more than I had bargained for. I'd seen the man's erratic driving, his violent behavior, but I had assumed it was a one-time thing, a freak accident. But if what she was saying was true, there was more to it. Something deeper. Something far more dangerous. I quickly typed back, "What kind of group? What was in the car?" The response was slower this time. "I'm not supposed to say too much, but look, I heard some officers talking. There were maps, names, addresses, stuff like that. I don't know, but it sounded like he was part of something big. And it didn't seem like it was just about the girl. They were after something else too." My heart dropped into my stomach. The girl. The woman I had seen in the car. I thought she was just the victim, just a random target of some drunk, out-of-control man. But now, I wasn't so sure. Was she just a pawn in a larger scheme? I felt a sudden cold shiver run down my spine. This wasn't some random attack. This wasn't just a man losing control behind the wheel. No, there was something much darker at play here. I didn't know how deep it went, but I needed to find out. I stuffed the phone into the glove compartment and took a deep breath. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more confusing and unsettling than the last. I couldn't sit idly by, not anymore. I had to find out the truth. But where did I start? I had no idea where to go from here. Should I go to the police? But they seemed to be keeping things under wraps. Besides, they had already told me they wouldn't give me any more details. The only lead I had was that damn sign. It had to mean something. It couldn't just be a random message. Someone was trying to tell me something, trying to lead me down a path. But who? The rest of the drive home was a blur. I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house. The world outside felt like a strange, foreign place, and I wasn't sure where I fit into it anymore. I had crossed a line, stepped into a world that I wasn't prepared for. I thought about what my coworker had said. They're still investigating. What was there left to investigate? Why had they sent me that sign? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was waiting for me to make a move. I shook the thought away. It was ridiculous. I was just overthinking everything. I had no reason to believe anyone was following me. I couldn't stop myself. The desire for answers, the need to understand everything was too powerful. I grabbed the sign from the back seat and looked at it again, the messy handwriting still imprinted on my mind. I examined it closely, trying to see something I might have missed the first time. But there was nothing else. No other information, no hidden clues. Just the simple thank you, and the unmistakable sense that there was something more behind it. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling that my life had changed forever. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I had become part of something much bigger than myself, something dangerous, something I didn't fully understand. I had a choice to make. I could walk away, forget about it, and let the police handle it. Or I could keep pushing, digging deeper, trying to find the truth, even if it meant risking everything. And just as I was about to drift off to sleep, the thought struck me like a bolt of lightning. What if the woman wasn't just a victim? What if she was involved too? I stared at the ceiling, the silence in the room deafening. I didn't have answers. I didn't have anything but more questions. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let it go. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. I had to know the truth, and I was willing to do whatever it took to find it. The days that followed felt like an endless blur. I couldn't focus on anything else. The image of the sign, the message, "Thank you for helping her," kept haunting me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Every time I glanced at my phone, I wondered if I had missed something. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, something I couldn't avoid no matter how hard I tried. The question that lingered in my mind was simple: who was behind all of this? I spent hours pacing my living room, the walls closing in around me. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The crash, the man's frantic driving, the woman in the back seat. What had been going on? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that there was more to the story. This wasn't just some random kidnapping gone wrong. This was planned. It had to be. The message from my coworker kept replaying in my mind. He wasn't just some random guy who got drunk and lost control. It was all planned. They found a lot of strange things in his car when they arrested him. Weapons, maps, names. This wasn't a coincidence. My gut told me that I had to keep digging. But how? Who could I turn to? The police were already involved. They were the ones who had arrested the man after all. And yet, something about their investigation didn't sit right with me. They weren't telling me everything. They weren't telling anyone everything. I decided I needed to find out more. The sign was a clue, but it was too vague. There had to be something else. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure I didn't forget what happened. That meant they didn't want me to drop it. But why? I spent the next few days talking to anyone I could think of. I called the hospital, asking about the victim, the woman who had been in the car. No one could give me any more details, but one thing I learned stuck with me. She had been hospitalized for days. Her injuries were severe. They didn't give me specifics, but from the way they talked, I got the sense that it wasn't just bruises and cuts. This woman had been through something far worse than I could imagine. I had to know who she was. I had to find out if she had been a random victim, or if she was involved in whatever this group was. I called my coworker again, desperate for more information. She seemed hesitant at first, but then she spoke quietly into the phone. "Look, I don't know all the details, but I heard someone say she was connected to the same group the man was a part of. She wasn't just an innocent bystander." That was it. A connection. I didn't know how deep it ran, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. She wasn't a victim. She was part of it. I spent the rest of the night Googling anything I could find related to the crash. I checked news articles, police reports, anything that might have more information about the man who had been arrested and the woman in the back seat. But all I found were snippets of vague details, each one offering more questions than answers. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't walk away. There was something much bigger at play here, and I had no intention of being left in the dark. The next day, I drove back to the area where the crash had happened. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had to go back. I felt like I was missing a piece of the puzzle. Maybe it was just paranoia, but the place felt different now. The empty field where the crash had taken place felt alive, like something was still lingering there, waiting for me to uncover it. I parked my car by the side of the road and got out. The place was deserted, as it always was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The wind blew gently through the trees, and the grass swayed as if something were hidden among the blades. I stood there for a long time, trying to see beyond the emptiness. And then, a car passed by, slowing down as it neared the spot. I caught a glimpse of the driver, a man, his face shadowed by the angle of the sun. For a brief moment I thought he might stop, but then he sped up again, disappearing down the road. I had no idea why, but I felt like he was connected to everything. It was the way he had looked at me. There had been something in his eyes, something calculating. I didn't know who he was, but I had to find out. I got back in my car, heart racing, and decided to follow him. It wasn't something I had planned to do, but I didn't have a choice. I had to know who he was. I had to know what he knew. I kept a safe distance, making sure not to follow too closely. The man didn't seem to notice me, and for a while, I thought it was just a coincidence. But then he took a sharp turn, heading into a wooded area on the outskirts of town. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but something told me that this was it, the moment that would reveal everything. I followed him deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around me. The road was narrow, and the further we went, the more isolated it became. I had no idea where this road led, but I couldn't stop now. Eventually, the man's car slowed to a stop, and he turned off the engine. I parked a few yards behind him, trying to remain unseen. I couldn't make out his movements clearly, but it was obvious he was waiting for someone. I stayed in my car, heart pounding, trying to steady my breathing. This was it. Whatever was happening, whatever secrets they were hiding, I was about to uncover them. Minutes passed, and then the car door opened. Another man stepped out. This one was tall, his features sharp, his movements deliberate. He looked around carefully before walking toward a small shack at the edge of the woods. I watched, holding my breath, wondering what they were doing. What was in that shack? Why had they come all the way out here? I didn't know how long I sat there watching them. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and I fought the urge to go up to them, to confront them right there. But I knew better. I had to stay hidden. I couldn't let them know I was here. I looked down at my phone, checking the time. It had been almost an hour. I couldn't keep waiting forever. I had to make a move. I grabbed my phone and quickly texted my coworker. I found something. I think I know where they are. I'm going to go in and check it out. But even as I sent the message, I felt a pang of doubt. What was I doing? Was this even a good idea? Before I could think too much longer, the men came back out of the shack. They were talking in low voices, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. One of them held a briefcase, and the other had something clutched tightly in his hand. I didn't know what it was, but my gut told me it wasn't good. I needed to make a decision. I could turn around and leave, forget this whole thing, or I could keep going, risk it all to find out what they were hiding. My mind raced. There was no turning back now. I pulled the car further down the road, getting closer to the shack. My heart was in my throat, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine and slowly stepped out of the car. The silence of the woods was deafening. I walked carefully toward the shack, trying to make as little noise as possible. Every step felt like an eternity, and every rustling leaf seemed to scream in the stillness. As I neared the door, I could hear them inside. They were speaking, their words muffled, but I could make out the occasional word. Deliver, tonight, pay off. I paused, listening harder. They were talking about something they needed to deliver, and they were getting paid. This wasn't just some random meeting. This was part of something much bigger. I turned to the man, trying to catch my breath. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaky from the adrenaline. "How did you know I needed help?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at me with a small, knowing smile. "I was sent to make sure you didn't get hurt. They've been watching you for a while now." I stared at him, confusion washing over me. Who has? Why? What's going on? What do you mean, they've been watching me? The man let out a long sigh, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. It's a lot to explain, but I'll keep it simple. There's a group. They've been running a network for years, kidnapping people, extorting money, doing terrible things. The man you saw in that car was just one of their pawns. The woman you saved wasn't the first, and she certainly won't be the last. I sat back in my seat, trying to process what he was saying. But I didn't know any of this. I was just trying to help. "I know," the man said, his eyes softening. "And that's why we need people like you. You've got a good heart, but you're tangled up in something much bigger than you realize. We've been tracking this group for a while now. They've got their hands in everything. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. You got too close, but we couldn't let them catch you." I was speechless, the gravity of what he was saying sinking in. "But what happens now?" He glanced at me, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We stopped them. You're not alone in this anymore. They might think they can intimidate you, but they don't know who they're dealing with." The car sped down the road, heading for the nearest town, but I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. Everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down. "You're going to be okay," the man assured me, as if sensing my fear. "But you need to trust me. We'll take care of the rest." The sound of the engine faded into the night, but in that moment, it felt like a new chapter was beginning. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for sure. I had started something that couldn't be undone. The game had changed, and I was no longer just a bystander. I had become part of the story, and this time, I was going to make sure the bad guys didn't win. Hi, my name's Callie. I'm 12 years old, and this story happened when I was 10. I'm telling you now because, well, some things should never be forgotten, even if they're scary. Back then, my mom and dad decided to send me to spend the summer with my Uncle Hal. Uncle Hal wasn't really my uncle, but he'd been my dad's best friend since they were kids. He lived in this big, creaky house on the edge of the Whispering Woods, a forest that everyone in town seemed to have stories about. Uncle Hal was a quiet man with a kind smile. He always wore flannel shirts, even in the summer, and he had a big bushy beard that made him look like a lumberjack. His house was old, filled with the smell of wood and pine. It had this giant fireplace in the living room, and Uncle Hal loved to sit there at night, carving little animals out of wood. There was another person living there too, Tobias. Tobias was Hal's handyman. He was tall and thin, with hair so light it was almost white. He always wore this long coat, even when he didn't need it. Tobias didn't talk much, and when he did, his voice was so soft you had to lean in to hear him. Now, about the Whispering Woods. People said you could hear the trees talk if you stood still long enough. Some said the whispers came from the wind. Others believed it was something else. Uncle Hal didn't believe in any of that stuff, but he warned me to stay away from the woods at night. "Callie," he said, "the forest can play tricks on your mind after dark." One night I was sitting by the fireplace watching Uncle Hal carve a tiny fox. Tobias was outside, fixing the fence that separated the yard from the forest. Suddenly the power went out. The house went pitch dark except for the flickering light of the fire. "Must be the storm," Uncle Hal said. "Tobias will check the generator." A few minutes later, Tobias came in, his face pale. "Generator's fine," he whispered. "But there's something in the woods." Uncle Hal frowned. "Probably just a deer or a raccoon," he said. Tobias shook his head. "No, it's not. It's something bigger." My heart started pounding. Uncle Hal grabbed a flashlight and his old hunting rifle just in case. "Stay inside, Callie," he said firmly. But I couldn't stay put. Curiosity got the better of me, and as soon as Uncle Hal and Tobias stepped outside, I slipped on my sneakers and followed them, staying far enough behind so they wouldn't see me. The night was cold, and the forest was darker than I'd ever seen. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves under our feet and the occasional hoot of an owl. Uncle Hal and Tobias walked deeper into the woods, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Then, we heard it. A low, growling sound that made my stomach drop. Uncle Hal froze, and Tobias whispered, "There, by the old tree." I peered around a tree trunk and saw it. At first, it looked like a large dog, but as it stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a dog at all. Its body was too thin, its limbs too long, and its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow. Uncle Hal raised his rifle, but the creature didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head, almost like it was studying us. Then it spoke, not with words, but in whispers that seemed to come from all around us. "Why do you disturb the forest?" the whispers asked. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Uncle Hal didn't say anything. He just tightened his grip on the rifle. Tobias, however, stepped forward. "We mean no harm," he said softly. "We're just passing through." The creature's eyes locked onto Tobias, and the whispers grew louder. "You carry the mark," they said. "You cannot hide." Uncle Hal glanced at Tobias, confused. "What's it talking about?" he asked. But Tobias didn't answer. He turned to me, his pale eyes full of fear. "Callie, go back to the house. Now." I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone. The creature took another step forward, and Tobias suddenly threw something into the air, a small wooden charm, carved with strange symbols. The creature recoiled, hissing, and the whispers turned into angry shouts. "Go!" Tobias shouted, pushing me toward the path. Uncle Hal grabbed my hand, and we ran. Behind us, the forest seemed to come alive. Branches reached out like fingers, trying to grab us. The whispers turned into wails, and I could feel the cold breath of the creature on my neck. We burst out of the woods and into the yard, slamming the door behind us. Tobias followed a few seconds later, his coat torn and his face scratched. Uncle Hal locked the door and turned to Tobias. "What was that thing?" Tobias sat down heavily, his hands shaking. "A forest guardian," he said. "They protect the woods, but they don't like outsiders." Uncle Hal looked at him suspiciously. "And what did it mean about the mark?" Tobias didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, his face pale and haunted. That night, I barely slept. The whispers of the forest echoed in my ears, and I couldn't shake the image of those glowing yellow eyes. The next morning, Tobias was gone. He left a note saying he couldn't stay, that it was too dangerous. Uncle Hal and I never spoke about that night again, but I still think about it sometimes. The whispering woods are still there, and every time I visit Uncle Hal, I stay far, far away from them, because some whispers are better left unheard. Hi kids. Tonight I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me when I was younger. It's not a fairy tale, but it's a story that taught me to trust my gut and pay attention to the world around me. It's a little spooky, but don't worry. You're safe here with me. When I was 10, my mom used to drive my dad to work at a craft store. His name was Lyndon, and he loved making things with his hands. He carved little wooden animals and painted them in bright colors. He worked late shifts, and we'd drive him there after dinner. My mom's name is Mira, and she always told the best stories on those drives. She called it our night adventures. One cold night, I had fallen asleep in the back seat, snuggled under a blanket. We were driving on a long, quiet road in Northern California. The kind of road where the trees lean in close and the stars peek through the branches. The car hummed softly, and I felt safe. I woke up when I felt the car slow down. My mom was talking softly. "It's just a passing zone," she muttered. I peeked out the window. Another car, all black, was right behind us. No headlights, no noise. Just there, like it had appeared out of nowhere. Mom sped up a little, but the car stayed close. Then, something weird happened. The car flashed its lights at us, bright white lights, but no sirens. It looked like a police car, but something felt off. My mom sighed and pulled over to the side of the road, turning on her hazard lights. She reached for her license and insurance card. "Stay quiet, sweetheart," she whispered to me. I nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around me. The man got out of his car, and I remember thinking he didn't move like a regular person. He wasn't rushing or walking slowly. He just glided. His clothes were strange too. He wore all black, like a shadow, and there was no badge, no uniform, just darkness. Mom rolled down her window a little. "Good evening, officer," she said, even though something in her voice sounded unsure. She handed him her license. The man didn't say anything. He stared at the card, holding it for what felt like forever. I remember feeling really cold, even though I had my blanket. I looked up at the man's face. It was hard to see clearly, but his eyes, they were the kind of eyes that don't blink much. He looked past Mom and stared right at me in the back seat. I held my breath. "Is everything okay?" Mom asked, her voice a little shakier now. "Can I have your badge number?" Still, he didn't answer. He just stared a little longer, then handed back the license without a word. He turned and walked back to his car. I watched him get in and drive away. No sirens, no noise, just gone. Mom didn't wait. She pulled back onto the road and drove fast, faster than she usually did. She kept checking the rearview mirror, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. I didn't say anything. I just watched her, feeling my heart thump in my chest. When we finally reached Dad's work, Mom told him everything. Her voice trembled and I could see tears in her eyes. Dad listened carefully, his face serious. He hugged us both and told Mom she did the right thing. Later that night, as we drove home, I asked, "Mom, who do you think he was?" "I don't know, sweetheart," she said softly. "But sometimes when something feels wrong, you have to trust that feeling. Always listen to that little voice inside you." After that night, I started noticing little things more, like how some shadows seem to move when they shouldn't, or how quiet can feel heavy, like it's hiding something. But the most important thing I learned? Trust your instincts. Now, I know this story sounds spooky, but remember, nothing bad happened. We were safe because Mom stayed calm and smart. So, next time you feel a little nervous or unsure, remember to listen to your gut. It's pretty smart. Okay, now snuggle up and close your eyes. Sweet dreams, little one. And remember, your story will always end happily if you trust yourself. Good night. Hi there, ready for a story? This one's a little spooky, but don't worry, it has a happy ending. It's about something that happened to me a long time ago. You might think I made it up, but I promise it's all true. So, snuggle up and listen closely. My name is Raina, and when I was around 8 years old, my mom and I used to drive my Uncle Theo to work. Uncle Theo wasn't really my uncle, but he was my mom's best friend. He worked the night shift at a place called the Oak Market. He stocked the shelves and made sure everything looked perfect for customers in the morning. We lived in a small town surrounded by tall trees and winding roads, the kind of place where you know most people by name, and nights are very quiet. My mom, Ellie, loved driving at night. She said it was peaceful, like the world was sleeping. One night we were taking Uncle Theo to work. It was late, around 9:30, and the stars were shining. I had a fuzzy blanket wrapped around me, and I felt cozy as I drifted off in the back seat. I could hear the soft hum of the car, and it made me sleepy. But then, something made me wake up. The car slowed down, and I heard my mom's voice. "That's strange," she whispered. I opened my eyes and saw another car behind us. It was all black, with no headlights on. It was just following us, quiet and dark. We were on a 2-lane road, but soon it would merge into 1 lane. Mom glanced in the mirror. "Let's just let them pass," she said calmly. Uncle Theo didn't say anything, but he leaned forward a bit, watching. As the road narrowed, the black car didn't pass. Instead, it slowed down too, staying right behind us. Mom pulled to the side, letting it go by. But as it passed, the car's lights suddenly flicked on, bright and blinding. There were no sirens, no flashing police lights, just the headlights. Mom sighed, reaching for her purse. "Stay calm," she said softly. "Probably just a random check." She rolled down the window as the car stopped behind us. The man who stepped out didn't look like any police officer I'd ever seen. He was tall and wore all black, but no uniform, no badge, just a plain black hoodie and dark pants. He moved quietly, like he was gliding across the road. Mom handed him her license and insurance card. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The man didn't answer. He just looked at the card, holding it for a long time. Too long. I could feel the air in the car get colder, like the warmth was being sucked out. Uncle Theo shifted in his seat, watching the man closely. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked. Still, no response. The man's face was hard to see in the dim light, but his eyes, they didn't blink. He stared at the back seat, right at me. I froze, clutching my blanket tighter. Mom cleared her throat. "Can I see your badge number?" she asked. Her voice was firmer now. The man didn't say anything. He just handed back the license and walked away, back to his car. No noise, no rush. He got in and drove off, disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, none of us moved. Mom's hands were shaking as she gripped the wheel. Uncle Theo looked back at me, his eyes wide. "Let's get out of here," Mom said finally, her voice trembling. She started the car and drove fast, faster than I'd ever seen her drive. She kept checking the mirrors, making sure the black car wasn't following us. When we got to Uncle Theo's work, he called the local sheriff. They promised to look into it, but I could tell Mom was still scared. That night, she sat on my bed and held my hand. "Raina," she said softly, "sometimes things happen that we can't explain. But you were brave tonight, and that's what matters." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching me. Now, whenever we drive at night, I always pay attention. I watch the road, the cars, and listen to that little voice inside me that tells me when something feels off. And if you ever feel something's not right, trust yourself. You're smarter than you think. All right, time for bed. Sweet dreams. And remember, no matter what, you're safe here. Good night. It was late November, and the snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes, piling up quickly on the road ahead. The world outside was a blur of white, and the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine and the occasional swish of tires cutting through the slush. I had been driving for hours, my eyes fixed on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a mix of determination and growing fatigue. The drive itself hadn't been too bad at first, but as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the snowstorm began to intensify. The visibility got worse, and my focus shifted from just staying on the road to making sure I didn't skid off it altogether. I'd taken this long trip 100 times before, usually with little more than a dull sense of routine. But this time felt different. I was heading to a small town a few hundred miles away for a business meeting. The company I worked for had recently gone through some significant changes, and I had been assigned to take over a few accounts that required some personal attention. It was my first big trip in my new role, and I wasn't sure what to expect. All I knew was that the meeting was crucial, and I needed to be there. The snow continued to fall, covering the entire world outside in a cold, white blanket. I hadn't seen another car on the road for the last half hour, and the emptiness made the drive feel even more isolating. The kind of isolation where you start to think about everything and nothing all at once. Your mind races while your body keeps on autopilot. The storm had made the roads treacherous, and I could feel my concentration starting to slip. My body was aching from sitting in the same position for so long. The constant shift between pressing the gas and brakes was beginning to take its toll on my back, and I was already counting down the minutes until I could stop. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. I hadn't expected to be driving this late, but the meeting earlier in the day had run longer than expected, and I had lost track of time while driving. The last thing I wanted was to continue in these conditions, especially when I wasn't sure how much farther I had to go. I reached for the car's dashboard, flipping on the wipers to clear the snow accumulating on the windshield. The snowflakes were so thick now that I could barely make out the headlights of the few cars that occasionally passed in the opposite direction. My eyes strained to focus, and the fatigue from hours of driving was beginning to weigh heavily on me. That's when I saw the sign, a green road sign that indicated a town up ahead with a motel just a few miles away. My heart lifted at the thought of getting off the road for the night. I needed a break, a warm bed, and a chance to clear my mind before heading out again in the morning. At this point, the thought of staying in the car overnight seemed even less appealing than the idea of a hotel. So, without hesitation, I turned off the highway and followed the signs leading to the motel. The snow was falling even harder now as I drove down a small, narrow road toward the motel. The headlights of my car cast long shadows across the trees and snowbanks. I couldn't help but feel a slight sense of unease. It wasn't so much fear, but a strange, nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're alone in unfamiliar places, and the world feels quiet, almost too quiet. The motel came into view just ahead, its lights shining brightly against the heavy snowfall. The building was small, no more than 2 stories high, with a sign that read Woodland Inn. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars parked haphazardly near the entrance. I pulled up, parked my car, and turned off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, staring out at the snow-covered world. It felt peaceful in its own way, but also eerily desolate. I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the cold. The air was sharp, biting at my skin, but I didn't mind it. The cold seemed to heighten my senses, sharpening everything around me. As I walked to the entrance of the motel, the crunch of snow beneath my boots was the only sound I could hear. It almost felt like I was walking in a dream, like the whole world had slowed down, and I was the only one moving through it. The lobby of the motel was small, but warm. The receptionist, an older man with graying hair and a friendly smile, looked up as I entered. He was sitting behind a desk, reading something, but he quickly put it down when he saw me. "Good evening," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. "How can I help you?" "I need a room for the night," I replied, my voice a little more tired than I intended, preferably a quiet one. "No problem," he said, standing up and walking over to the counter where a register sat. He quickly typed in my information and I handed him my ID and credit card. As he processed the payment, he asked, "Traveling far?" "Yeah, a few 100 miles, I said, glancing at the clock. It was already past 9 o'clock p.m., and I was starting to feel the weight of the long drive. "Just passing through for work." "You'll find it quiet here," he said, giving me a reassuring smile. "Not much goes on in this part of town." I didn't really respond, just nodded and took the key he handed me. It had a small plastic tag with the room number, 104, printed on it. "Your room's down the hall on the left," the receptionist said. "If you need anything, just give me a shout." I thanked him and made my way down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent motel. The carpet was old and faded, the walls covered in cheap floral wallpaper that had seen better days. The whole place had a run-down feel, but in a way, it was kind of comforting. It felt like the kind of place where nothing ever changed, where everything stayed the same. I reached my room and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The room was small but clean enough, with a queen-sized bed covered in a floral bedspread, a small wooden desk, and a dresser with a TV on top. The bathroom was tucked into the corner, and the light from the lamp near the bed gave the room a soft, warm glow. I quickly locked the door behind me, making sure to double-check the deadbolt. The idea of someone just walking into my room didn't sit well with me, and I didn't feel like taking any chances. After all, I was on the road alone, in an unfamiliar place, in the middle of nowhere. It's easy to let your guard down when you're tired, but I didn't want to do that just yet. I tossed my bag on the bed and went to the bathroom to wash my face. The cold water helped clear my head a little, and as I stood in front of the mirror, I thought about the drive ahead. Tomorrow's meeting was important, but tonight, I was just glad to be off the road. I had planned on just grabbing a quick snack and turning in for the night, but I felt restless. The hours of driving had taken a toll on my body, and I could feel the soreness setting in. My muscles ached, and my back throbbed from sitting in one position for so long. I needed to stretch, to move around for a bit. The hotel had a small indoor pool, according to the receptionist, and I figured it might be just what I needed to relax. So, I grabbed my swim trunks, slipped on a hoodie, and headed out of the room. The pool area was quiet, and the warm air inside felt like a relief after the cold night air. There was a hot tub in the corner, and the pool was dimly lit by soft yellow lights hanging from the ceiling. The only sound was the gentle hum of the heater and the soft splash of water as I dipped my toes into the pool. It felt good, really good. My body had been cooped up in the car for far too long, and the warm water helped relax my sore muscles. I swam a few laps, my mind wandering to the events of the day. Everything felt so distant here, like the snowstorm outside had separated me from everything I knew. And then I saw him. He was sitting in the far corner, near the hot tub, his back against the wall, and his eyes staring directly at me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, maybe someone who had come in while I wasn't paying attention. But no, he was sitting completely still, not moving a muscle. The dim lighting made it hard to make out his features, but I could feel his eyes on me. It was unnerving. I tried to shake it off, but something in the back of my mind told me that I wasn't alone. Not really. Every time I glanced in his direction, his eyes would shift away for a moment, only to return to me when I looked away. I tried to ignore him, but the sense of discomfort was growing, tightening in my chest. I couldn't stay here. It wasn't a feeling I could explain, but it was enough to make me leave. I got out of the pool quickly, not bothering to dry off properly. I grabbed my towel and headed back to my room, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed back to my room, almost stumbling in my haste. The hallway seemed unusually long as I made my way to the door, every step echoing in the silence. My thoughts were clouded with confusion and unease. What had I just experienced in the pool area? I'd never been the type to feel paranoid, but something about that man sitting there, watching me, so still, so quiet, had stirred something deep within me. I didn't even bother to take a deep breath before I unlocked the door to my room and slipped inside. I clicked the lock shut behind me with a sense of relief, and for a moment, I just stood there, leaning against the door as if to convince myself that everything was fine. But nothing about this felt fine. The room was still warm, the soft glow of the lamp by the bed casting a comforting light across the room, but no matter how much I tried to focus on the familiar sights around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, the silence too absolute. I dropped my towel and swim trunks onto the bed and walked toward the window, peering out through the snow-covered glass. The night was still and quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind that swept snowflakes across the streetlights. The parking lot outside was nearly empty. Only a few cars remained parked in the same spots, seemingly untouched since I had arrived. I couldn't see anything that would explain the unease crawling up my spine, but the feeling didn't go away. It was as if I were being watched, and not just by that man at the pool. Something about the stillness outside made me feel exposed. I turned away from the window and let out a long sigh. This wasn't like me. Normally, I would brush off these feelings, tell myself to stop overthinking. But tonight, in this isolated motel room, it felt different. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table, checking the time. It was 9:45 p.m. The meeting tomorrow was important, but it was hard to think about it now with everything going on. I didn't want to overthink, but I couldn't help it. With a frustrated groan, I flopped back onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. Maybe I just needed to sleep. The exhaustion from driving all day, coupled with the strange encounter at the pool, was starting to wear on me. I pulled the blankets over myself, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of discomfort that still lingered. The minutes dragged by, and I found myself unable to fall asleep. Every little sound, the creaking of the building, the hum of the heater, seemed amplified in the silence. My mind kept returning to that man in the pool, and the way he had watched me, never saying a word, never moving. It made my stomach turn just thinking about it. I reached for the TV remote on the bedside table and turned on the small television that sat on the dresser across the room. The glow from the screen was soft, and for a moment it helped distract me from the gnawing sense of dread that refused to leave. I flicked through the channels aimlessly, looking for something to take my mind off everything. Eventually, I settled on some random late-night talk show. The host's jokes were mindless, but at least it was noise, something to fill the oppressive silence. I let the show play in the background, not really paying attention to what they were saying, just focusing on the way the words and laughter blended together to create a sense of normalcy. It wasn't long before I heard something. A faint sound, almost like a knock, soft but distinct. I froze, my body tensing. The noise hadn't come from the TV. It was real. I sat up in bed, straining to hear it again. Knock. Knock. This time it was louder, and I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone was knocking on my door. I felt a chill creep down my spine, my instincts immediately on edge. Who could it be? The receptionist had already gone to bed, and the only other guests I had seen in the hotel were a few older couples, most of whom had checked in hours ago. Why would anyone be at my door now? I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Should I open it? Should I just ignore it and hope whoever it was would go away? The knocking came again, this time more insistent, louder. It was coming from the door to my room. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it. I got up slowly from the bed, my legs feeling like they were moving through molasses. My heart thudded in my chest, and my mind raced with questions. What if it was someone who needed help? What if it was just the man from the pool? A million thoughts flooded my brain, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't ready to face whatever was on the other side of that door. I tiptoed quietly across the room, careful not to make a sound. As I reached the door, I looked through the peephole. What I saw made my stomach drop. There, standing in the dim hallway light, was a man. It was the same man from the pool. His eyes were locked on the door, and his expression was unreadable. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The man hadn't seen me peering through the peephole, but I felt as if he had. His presence was so intense, so unnerving, that I could hardly gather my thoughts. What did he want? Why was he standing outside my room? I pressed myself back against the wall, hoping he wouldn't hear the sound of my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just open the door and confront him, not when everything inside me was screaming to stay away. After a long moment, I slowly backed away from the door, holding my breath. I glanced over at the phone on the nightstand. I had the hotel's front desk number programmed into my contacts. I could call for help, but I didn't. I hesitated, unsure if I was overreacting. The knocking stopped suddenly, and the silence returned. The absence of sound seemed even more deafening now, as if the entire world had paused. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to open the door, confront him, and demand to know why he was there. But another part of me, something deeper, knew that wouldn't be a good idea. Something didn't feel right, and I couldn't put my finger on it. After what felt like forever, I heard the faintest sound. Footsteps, moving away from the door. I couldn't believe it. He was leaving. My muscles, which had been stiff with fear, began to relax, though I was still on edge. I didn't move from my spot by the door, listening carefully to the sounds outside. The footsteps grew quieter, and eventually they stopped. I waited. I waited for him to come back. But the silence remained, thick and suffocating. With great caution, I stepped away from the door and walked over to the window. I peered through the blinds, trying to catch a glimpse of him, but the snowstorm outside obscured any view of the parking lot. I stood there for a long time, staring into the nothingness. My mind was racing. Had he just left? Or was he still out there watching me, waiting for me to make the next move? The minutes stretched on. I felt trapped in that moment of uncertainty, unsure of what had just happened or what might happen next. Finally, I forced myself to leave the window and turned off the television. I had to try to sleep, even if I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I pulled the covers back over myself and lay still, my mind wide awake. The sound of the wind howling outside the motel building was all I could hear. The storm seemed to be picking up again, the wind stronger now, whipping snow against the window with a force that made the whole room feel like it was shaking. I tried to tell myself that everything would be fine, that I was just overreacting. But the feeling of unease clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't ignore it. As I finally closed my eyes and tried to settle into sleep, I couldn't shake the thought, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when morning came. The night stretched on endlessly, each minute dragging longer than the last. No matter how hard I tried to relax, the sense of unease never left me. I couldn't stop thinking about that man, his stillness by the pool, the way he had just appeared outside my door, and the oppressive silence that had followed. I lay in bed, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of everything, but I couldn't. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes as the snowstorm intensified. It felt like the storm was matching the turbulence in my head, as if nature itself could sense my unease. Every gust of wind, every creak of the building seemed amplified in the stillness of my room. The quiet was maddening. I kept telling myself that everything would be okay, that it was just a weird coincidence. The man in the pool had probably been a worker at the hotel, maybe a security guard or maintenance person. The knock on the door? Maybe he had the wrong room or just wanted to ask something simple. But deep down, I knew better. It didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like something more, something darker. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling me from my spiraling thoughts. It was a text from work. Nothing urgent, just a reminder about the meeting tomorrow. It was a small relief, a distraction, and for a few moments, I tried to focus on the work-related message. But the truth was, I could barely concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to the events of the evening. The knock. The man. I sat up in bed, feeling restless and trapped. It was late, but sleep wouldn't come. The sense of being watched, the feeling that someone was out there, lingered in the air like an invisible presence. It was suffocating. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. Too early to do anything, but too late to try and get comfortable again. I sighed heavily and threw back the covers, deciding that maybe getting some fresh air would help clear my mind. I didn't know what else to do. Slipping on a jacket, I grabbed my key card and left the room. The hall was eerily quiet. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a yellowish glow on the carpeted floor. The place felt almost deserted. Silent except for the distant hum of the heating system. As I walked down the hallway, I passed the vending machines, the empty chairs by the elevator, and the long stretch of empty rooms. My footsteps echoed in the corridor, a constant reminder of how alone I was in this strange place. I stepped outside into the cold night, the chill immediately biting at my skin. The snowstorm had only worsened since I had arrived. The wind stung my face, and the falling snowflakes swirled around me, cutting off any view beyond the parking lot. The world outside seemed muffled, distant, cut off from everything. I walked aimlessly, trying to clear my head, but my mind kept returning to that man. His presence had unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. And now, even out here in the cold, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby, that he was somehow watching me. I glanced back toward the hotel entrance, unsure of why I had come outside. The darkness seemed to swallow the building whole, leaving no trace of the people inside. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't help feeling like something was wrong. That's when I heard it. A noise, a faint sound that came from the direction of the lobby. It wasn't a voice, but it was unmistakable. Footsteps. The sound of someone walking quietly, almost deliberately. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening carefully. The footsteps were getting closer, moving down the hall toward the exit. My pulse quickened. I glanced nervously at the hotel entrance, trying to make sense of the situation. Was someone else out there? Someone who shouldn't be? The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears, but the silence returned. I was paralyzed by the uncertainty of it all. What should I do? Should I go back inside? Or should I confront whoever it was? My instincts screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't. Something was compelling me to stay. Then, I heard it again. The soft sound of the door opening, followed by the unmistakable sound of shoes crunching on the snow outside. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was definitely out there. I turned quickly, heading back toward the entrance of the hotel, my feet crunching against the freshly fallen snow. My breath came out in misty clouds, and the cold cut through my jacket as I hurried to reach the door. My heart was pounding now, the sound of it deafening in my ears. As I stepped back inside the warmth of the hotel, I quickly scanned the lobby. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a harsh light on the empty room. No one was there, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped deeper into the lobby. Something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight that I couldn't explain. It felt as if the entire building was holding its breath. I walked to the front desk, half expecting to find the night clerk still working, but the desk was empty. There was no sign of anyone, no hint of life behind the counter. It was as if the entire hotel had fallen into an eerie slumber. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:30 a.m. now. Something didn't feel right. I had no reason to think that anything was actually wrong, but every instinct in my body was telling me otherwise. I had to know what was going on. I had to find out what was happening in this place. My first thought was to check the hotel's security footage. If I could get access to it, I could see what had been happening while I was locked away in my room. But where would I even begin to look? I turned back toward the hallway, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. The hotel had been quiet since I arrived, but now it seemed unnervingly still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was hiding in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. As I passed the vending machines again, a sudden movement caught my eye. A figure, hunched over near the corner by the elevator. It was him, the man from the pool. He was standing there watching me with the same unsettling intensity as before. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I felt like I was trapped in his gaze, unable to look away. His expression was unreadable. No smile, no gesture, just that steady, unblinking stare. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he took a step toward me. My body reacted on instinct. I turned and sprinted down the hallway toward the nearest stairwell, my breath coming in quick gasps. The sound of his footsteps followed me, growing louder with each passing second. I could feel him getting closer, could hear the soft shuffle of his shoes on the carpet, just behind me. I reached the stairwell and slammed the door open, running up the stairs as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, my legs burning from the effort. The hotel seemed endless, the staircase winding up and up as if it would never stop. I didn't dare look back. I kept running, my mind focused on getting as far away from him as possible. I could hear the footsteps behind me, following me up the stairs, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, after what felt like forever, I reached the top floor. I gasped for air, trying to steady my breathing. I could hear the sound of footsteps stopping just behind me, and then the heavy silence returned. I turned to face the hallway. The floor was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The hotel seemed empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved slowly, cautiously, down the hall. The air felt thick with tension, and every door I passed seemed to be watching me. I couldn't explain it, but I was sure of one thing. This wasn't a normal hotel. There was something dark about this place, something that wasn't right. And now, I was trapped in it. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was stronger than ever. It had followed me up the stairs, into this desolate hallway. The question wasn't whether I was alone anymore. The question was, how long would it take for the truth to finally catch up with me? The hallway stretched out before me, longer than I had remembered. It seemed as though the hotel's architecture had become warped, twisted by my fear and paranoia. Each step I took felt like a journey further into the unknown, my footfalls muffled by the plush carpet beneath me. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead only added to the atmosphere of dread. I couldn't explain it. My thoughts were clouded by an overwhelming sense of urgency, as though something terrible was just around the corner, waiting for me to take one wrong step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, the silence pressing in from all sides. I glanced behind me. The stairwell door, which I had just come through, was now closed. I couldn't hear any footsteps anymore. For a fleeting moment, I dared to believe that I had outrun the man who had been following me. But even as I thought this, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that I wasn't alone. My footsteps echoed in the quiet, and I couldn't help but wonder, was I hearing my own breathing, or was it someone else's? My mind raced with possibilities. What had I stumbled into? Was this all some sort of sick game? I couldn't get rid of the image of that man's face, the way he had appeared out of nowhere by the pool, the way he had lingered outside my door just watching. I had to know what was going on. Determined to find answers, I pressed on, my pace quickening as I neared the end of the hallway. At the far end, I could see the door to a maintenance room. The small light above it flickered, casting an eerie glow in the darkened hallway. I hesitated for a moment, but then my curiosity won over. I approached the door cautiously, half expecting it to creak open on its own. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. My hand shook as I pushed it open. The room inside was dimly lit, with a single overhead light casting shadows across shelves filled with cleaning supplies and tools. But it wasn't the shelves that caught my attention. It was the figure standing in the corner of the room, hunched over and staring at something in their hands. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My heart thudded in my chest as I recognized the figure standing there. It was him, the man from the pool. I was sure of it. He was wearing the same dark uniform, though it looked like he had put on a jacket over it, trying to blend in. His face was turned toward the light, his features partially obscured by shadows. But there was no mistaking it. The same eyes, the same stiff posture, the same unsettling presence. He didn't seem to notice me standing in the doorway. His eyes were fixed on whatever he was holding in his hands. I couldn't make out what it was from where I stood, but I could feel my stomach tighten with anxiety. I needed to leave, to turn and run back to my room. But for some reason, my feet refused to move. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a combination of fear and disbelief. What was he doing here? Why was he in this maintenance room, in the middle of the night? I shifted slightly, trying to make myself less noticeable, but the floor creaked beneath my weight. The man's head snapped toward the door, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by something else, something dark, something malicious. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a smile of relief or recognition. It was a predatory grin, one that sent a chill crawling down my spine. His eyes darkened as he took a step toward me. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice low, almost mocking. I couldn't find my voice at first. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there and face him. But my feet were glued to the floor, my heart racing in my chest. You're the one who's been following me? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. He didn't respond at first. He just stood there, grinning like he knew something I didn't. You shouldn't be here, I added, my mind racing with panic. I saw you at the pool. You knocked on my door. What do you want from me? The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. I think you already know what I want, he said, his tone now low and threatening. I didn't know what to say, how to respond to that. I felt as though I was trapped in a nightmare. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. I took a step back, instinctively reaching for the door handle. But before I could make it, he moved faster than I expected, his hand grabbing my wrist with a vice-like grip. I gasped, my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. You don't want to run, he whispered, his voice now colder, more dangerous. You'll make things worse for yourself if you do. I stopped struggling, my mind racing for an escape. What was he talking about? What did he mean? His grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. Instead, he pulled me further into the maintenance room, where the dim light revealed something I hadn't noticed before. A series of monitors stacked on a desk, each one displaying a different angle of the hotel's hallways. I could feel my stomach drop as I realized what I was looking at. The man had been watching me, the whole time. He smiled again, reading my expression. Don't be so surprised. I've been keeping an eye on you. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What was happening? Why was he doing this? Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. He chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. You're not as smart as I thought, but that's okay. You'll learn soon enough. I tried to pull away again, but his grip tightened once more. You don't understand, he said, his voice dripping with malice. You're not here by accident. None of us are. The hotel, the people in it. It's all connected. You should have left when you had the chance. My mind was racing. The hotel wasn't what it seemed. The man wasn't just a random guest or a worker. He was part of something darker, something much more dangerous. I had to get out. I had to warn someone. Let go of me, I shouted, finally summoning the strength to break free. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but it was only for an instant. Then, with a cold laugh, he released my wrist and stepped back. I'll let you go, he said, his voice suddenly casual. But remember, I'll be watching. I didn't wait another second. I turned and bolted for the door, my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't dare look back. I raced down the hall, my mind spinning. I had no idea where to go or what to do. All I knew was that I had to get away from him, away from the twisted reality I had stumbled into. I burst into the nearest stairwell, taking the steps two at a time. My breath was ragged, my legs burning, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to get out of this hotel. But the truth was beginning to dawn on me. The man in the maintenance room, the strange events of the past few hours, it was all part of something bigger, something much darker. And I was in the middle of it. I didn't know where I was running, or where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away from that man as possible. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the stairwell as I scrambled down, feeling the adrenaline coursing through me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath ragged and shallow. The cold metal railing scraped against my palm as I pressed my hand against it, desperately propelling myself forward. I could still hear his voice in my mind, cold and mocking, his words echoing in the empty space around me. You're not here by accident. None of us are. The hotel, the people in it, it's all connected. Those words twisted in my mind, coiling like a snake in my gut. What did he mean by that? What was going on? How was this hotel connected to him? I had no answers, just questions. Questions that grew more terrifying with each step I took. The man was right. I should have left when I had the chance, but it was too late now. I was in too deep. My legs burned as I reached the bottom of the stairwell, but I didn't stop. The lobby was just ahead, and for the first time since all of this had started, I felt a flicker of hope. If I could just make it there, I could tell someone, anyone, what was going on. Maybe the front desk clerk would help. Maybe the police would finally listen to me. But as I rounded the corner, the sight that greeted me stopped me dead in my tracks. The lobby was dark, too dark. The usual fluorescent lights that hummed overhead were now off, leaving the entire space bathed in an eerie dimness. The furniture, usually arranged neatly, was now disheveled. Chairs were overturned, and the carpets were littered with pieces of broken glass. But it wasn't the mess that made my stomach drop. It was the figure standing behind the desk. The man from the maintenance room. He was standing there, leaning casually against the counter, as though nothing were wrong. He didn't seem in any hurry. There was no urgency in his movements, no fear in his eyes, just that same chilling smile, the same predatory expression that had haunted me all night. I froze, my body going stiff with terror. He looked at me, and for a moment, it was as if he could see straight through me. He knew exactly what I was thinking. He knew I was trapped. "You should have stayed in your room," he said, his voice smooth and even, like we were having an ordinary conversation. But there was nothing ordinary about this. But it's too late for that now. I backed away slowly, my mind racing for an escape route. There had to be another way out. Another door, another window, anything. But the hotel felt like it had transformed. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the hallway I had just run through now seemed endless. "You think you can just run?" His voice sliced through the air, a sneer lacing his words. "There's no way out. Not for you. Not for anyone." His words hung in the air, settling in my stomach like a weight, dragging me down. How had he gotten here so quickly? Had he been watching me the whole time? It seemed impossible. How could I have missed him? But in that moment, I knew. I knew this man wasn't just some random creep following me around the hotel. He was something else. Something darker. Something part of whatever twisted system was behind this place. I had to escape. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen. My legs refused to move. He had me cornered, and I didn't know what to do. "I'll tell you something," he continued, his voice a low murmur now, as if we were sharing some dark secret. "You're not the first person to try and leave. People come and go, but they always end up coming back. There's no escaping. This place..." He paused, as though savoring the words. "This place doesn't let you go." His words hit me like a slap to the face. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the gravity of what he was saying. "You're trapped here, just like the rest of us," he added, his grin widening. "There's no way out. Not unless you understand the rules." I swallowed hard, trying to force words out, trying to think clearly, but all that came out was a dry gasp. "What do you mean?" He straightened up, pushing away from the desk. "I mean," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child, "that this hotel is more than just a place to stay. It's a prison, a cage, and no matter how hard you try to escape, it won't let you." I shook my head, disbelief and fear battling inside me. This couldn't be true. It couldn't be. "It's true," he insisted, taking a step closer to me. "There are rules. And those rules, well, they don't just apply to you. They apply to everyone here. Everyone who stays." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something in his voice, something in the way he spoke, made it clear that this wasn't some delusion. He wasn't crazy. He was speaking the truth. I took another step back, my mind racing. "Why are you telling me this?" I demanded, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. He smirked. "Because I'm the one who gets to decide who gets to leave. You've made a mistake by staying too long. Now, I'm here to help you understand why it's so hard to leave this place." "What do you mean, decide?" I asked, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "Who are you? What is this place?" He chuckled darkly. "Oh, I'm just a small part of it, but I'm an important one. You see, the hotel..." He gestured around us, as if the building itself was alive. "Isn't really a hotel. Not in the way you think. It's a waiting room. A place where people end up when they're lost. People who need to face the truth." I shook my head again, trying to block out his words. "What are you talking about?" He took another step toward me, his presence looming over me. "I told you this place doesn't let you go. Not unless you've learned what you need to. But you're not ready yet." A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a strange, growing dread. The walls around me seemed to close in, the air heavy with tension. "You're going to help me learn," he said softly, "whether you like it or not." I wanted to scream, to fight, to run away, but I knew I couldn't. I was trapped in this nightmare of a hotel that refused to let me go. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not sure who I was apologizing to, but feeling like I needed to say it. "I don't understand. I just want to leave." His grin widened again, that same dark, predatory smile. "That's the problem. You think you can just leave, but you're wrong. You can't." I felt my stomach churn as I backed up against the wall. I had to escape. There had to be a way out. "Let me go," I pleaded, but my voice cracked. The man took one final step toward me, his face now inches from mine. "You'll learn eventually. You just have to understand the rules. Only then will you be able to leave." His words echoed in my head like a haunting melody. "Only then will you be able to leave." The idea, the sheer horror of it, began to sink in. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't just stuck in a hotel. I was stuck in something far worse. A prison built on lies, deception, and the terror of being unable to escape. The only question was whether I would ever learn the rules in time to leave, or if I would become just another part of the hotel's twisted design. Before I could process it further, I heard something. A distant sound, like a door creaking open. And then, another voice. A woman's voice. "Let her go, Simon." The man, Simon, turned slowly, his expression shifting for the first time. His smirk faltered, and he glanced toward the source of the voice. I turned too, my heart racing. Standing at the end of the hallway was a woman. Tall, with dark hair, her face hidden in shadow. She was watching us, her eyes glowing in the dim light. "Who are you?" I whispered, fear lacing my words. She stepped forward. "I'm someone who can help you, but first, you need to leave him behind." Simon turned his gaze back to me. His smile faltered. "Don't listen to her," he hissed. "You don't need anyone else. Not anymore." I didn't know who to trust, but the woman's presence felt like the first hope I had felt all night. I turned away from Simon, my legs trembling as I moved toward her. Simon didn't move to stop me. I stepped into the hallway, leaving him behind, but I could still feel his eyes on me, cold and accusing. But the woman's voice cut through the tension, her tone steady and calm. "Come with me," she said softly. The woman's presence felt like a beacon of light in the suffocating darkness that had engulfed me for so long. As I walked towards her, my heart was pounding, my legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. The adrenaline from running, the panic of escaping Simon, was still coursing through me. But I felt something else too, an odd sense of hope. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to push me forward. She didn't say anything more as I approached, but her eyes, the way she looked at me, conveyed everything I needed to know. She wasn't here to hurt me. She wasn't here to trap me. In fact, everything about her seemed like a contrast to Simon. Where he had been cold, calculating, and controlling, she was calm, her expression almost serene, as if she had seen this before and knew exactly what needed to be done. When I reached her, she nodded toward a door at the end of the hallway. It was unmarked, just a plain wooden door, but something about it stood out. It didn't belong to the hotel. It felt like something different, something separate from the world I'd been trapped in for what felt like an eternity. "This way," she said softly, her voice like a whisper, yet firm with purpose. I didn't hesitate. I followed her, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Why had Simon been so intent on keeping me here? What was this hotel, and who was this woman? The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a room that seemed to stretch on forever. It was bright, almost blinding in comparison to the dimness of the hallways and lobby I had just escaped from. The walls were lined with mirrors, and in the center of the room was an old wooden chair, almost like a throne. There was no sign of anyone else inside, just the two of us. She stepped inside first, and I followed, feeling a sense of uncertainty settle over me. As I crossed the threshold, I felt something shift, like the air itself had changed. It was colder here, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was the kind of cold that made you feel alert, awake. The woman turned to face me. Her expression had softened, but her eyes were still intense, watching me closely. "You're here now," she said. "It's time to understand." "Understand what?" I asked, my voice trembling. I was beyond confused. There was no way I could piece all this together. The pieces didn't fit. I had to know what was happening. I had to know how to leave, how to get out of this nightmare. She sighed, her gaze falling to the floor for a brief moment before looking up again. "You've already learned part of the truth. This hotel, these people, none of it is what it seems. This place, it feeds on fear, on uncertainty. It's a place where lost souls are drawn, where people who don't know who they are or what they want come to try and figure it out." I frowned, my mind whirling. "But Simon, what was he? And why was he trying to stop me?" "He's part of the system," she explained quietly. "A keeper. His role is to make sure no one escapes until they've learned what they need to learn. But the truth is, most people never do. They become like him. They get trapped in the hotel, unable to leave because they refuse to accept the truth of who they are." I didn't understand. "What truth?" She stepped closer to me now, her voice becoming more urgent, more intense. "You're not like them. You've seen it. You've felt it. That's why you were able to escape. But it's not enough. You have to face it. You have to face yourself." I shook my head, panic rising again. "I don't know what you're talking about. I just want to leave. I just want to get out of here." Her eyes softened with sympathy, but there was something else there too. Something dark, something I couldn't quite place. "I know, but you're asking for something that can't be given, not without a price." "A price?" My stomach dropped. "What price?" "The price of letting go," she said softly. "The price of accepting who you really are." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. What was she saying? What did she mean by that? "The hotel feeds on the unresolved, on the part of yourself you've hidden away, the part you refuse to accept." She paused, letting the words sink in. "If you want to leave, you have to face that part. You have to look it in the eyes and accept it for what it is." I felt a wave of nausea sweep over me. "I don't understand." I didn't do anything. I'm not like Simon. I didn't. She interrupted me gently. It's not about what you did. It's about who you are. You've been running from it your whole life. But this place, this hotel, won't let you keep running. I took a step back, my mind racing. I didn't want to face whatever she was talking about. I didn't want to confront some hidden, dark part of myself. I didn't even know what that meant. What happens if I refuse? I whispered, my throat tight. She studied me for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy with a weight that sent a shiver down my spine. If you refuse, Simon will take over. He will keep you here, trapped forever, just like all the others. The hotel will claim you, and you will never be able to escape. I stood there in silence, the room closing in around me. I had thought the worst was over when I escaped Simon, but now I realized the real test was just beginning. The truth was, I wasn't free yet, not completely. The hotel hadn't let me go, not until I accepted the truth. I looked at the woman, my heart pounding. How do I face it? How do I face whatever this is? She stepped back, a sad smile on her face. You'll know when the time comes. It's something only you can do. For the first time, I noticed something strange about her. Her face. It was beginning to blur, as if she were fading into the surroundings, her form becoming less solid, less real. Panic rose in my chest again. What's happening? I gasped. She looked at me one last time, her expression now filled with something that resembled pity. You're ready. You've already made the decision, even if you don't realize it yet. Before I could ask another question, she disappeared, fading into the room until she was no longer there. The mirrors on the walls seemed to shimmer, rippling like water. I was alone. I turned to face the chair in the center of the room. The wooden chair, now glowing faintly in the dim light. I walked toward it slowly, a sense of dread creeping over me. The room was still, silent. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, but there was nothing else. No sound, no movement, just me and the chair. I knew what I had to do. There was no running anymore, no more avoiding the truth. I sat in the chair, my hands gripping the arms tightly as I closed my eyes. The room seemed to tilt, and I felt as though I was being pulled into something deeper, darker. And then, everything went black. I woke up in my bed. The sheets were warm, the room was quiet. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream. The hotel, Simon, the woman, the chair. But then I looked around. The hotel room was empty. The hallway outside was silent, and the only thing that remained was the lingering feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. I would never leave this place, because the truth was, this was home. Here's the adapted story for a spooky bedtime tale. All right, kids, settle down and listen closely, I said as I tucked them in. I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me many years ago when I was just about your age. It's a story I've never shared until now, and you'll soon understand why. It's the story of Ember Hollow and the Halloween that changed everything. I paused to let the words settle. The kids' eyes grew wide as they waited for me to begin. A long time ago, I lived in a small town called Ember Hollow. It was a place that looked cozy and peaceful during the day, with rows of colorful houses and streets lined with giant oak trees whose branches swayed gently in the wind. But when night fell, the town changed. Shadows stretched long and dark, and whispers seemed to drift on the breeze, even when no one was there. People in Ember Hollow were superstitious, especially about an old, abandoned inn at the edge of town. Now, the inn wasn't like any ordinary building. It was called the Lantern's Rest, and it had been shut down for as long as anyone could remember. Legend had it that the inn was cursed after a terrible tragedy happened there one Halloween night. The townsfolk didn't talk much about it, but if you ever asked, they'd tell you to stay away, especially on Halloween. I had 3 friends back then: Callum, Theo, and Margot. Callum was the daring one, always challenging us to explore places we shouldn't. Theo was the storyteller. He loved making up scary tales to freak us out. And Margot? She was the smart one, always warning us when something seemed like a bad idea. She was also the fastest runner, which came in handy when Callum's dares got us into trouble. That Halloween, we decided to dress up and head out for candy. Callum was a pirate, complete with a hat and a plastic sword. Theo was a wizard with a glowing wand, and Margot wore a spooky vampire costume with fake fangs. I went as a scarecrow, with straw sticking out of my sleeves and a floppy hat on my head. "Let's make this Halloween unforgettable," Callum declared, grinning mischievously. We started trick-or-treating as usual, running from house to house, filling our bags with candy. But as the night went on, Callum had an idea. "You know what would be really unforgettable?" he said, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Let's go to the Lantern's Rest, just for a look?" "No way," Margot said immediately. "Everyone says it's haunted. My grandma told me a story about it once," she said. "Ghost stories," Theo interrupted, trying to sound brave. "It's just an old building." "Exactly," Callum said. "What's the worst that could happen? We'll be in and out before you know it." I hesitated. I didn't want to go, but I didn't want to be the only one to back out either. So, reluctantly, we all agreed. When we got to the edge of town, there it was, the inn. It looked even creepier than I remembered, with its sagging roof and cracked windows. The door was slightly open, creaking as it swayed in the wind. Theo whispered, "It almost looks like it's waiting for us." "Don't be silly," Callum said, stepping forward. "Come on." Inside, the air was cold and damp. Dust coated everything, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling. The floor creaked under our feet as we walked. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Let's just take a quick look and leave," Margot said, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Relax," Callum said, but his voice sounded less confident now. We wandered through the old inn, finding broken furniture, faded wallpaper, and an old grandfather clock that had stopped ticking. But then something strange happened. Theo's flashlight flickered and went out. "Not funny, Theo," Margot said. "It's not me," Theo replied, shaking the flashlight. Suddenly we heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. We froze. "What was that?" I whispered. Before anyone could answer, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it looked like a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her face pale and gaunt. She was holding something, a lantern that cast an eerie glow around her. "Who's there?" Callum called out, his voice shaking. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she started walking toward us, slowly but deliberately. "Run!" Margot shouted, and we took off, sprinting back the way we came. But the inn seemed different now, like the hallways had shifted. Doors that had been open were now shut, and the way out seemed farther and farther away. Behind us, the dragging sound grew louder, and I could hear faint whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. I didn't dare look back. Finally, we burst through the front door and into the night. We didn't stop running until we were back in town, gasping for breath. The next day, we told everyone what had happened, but most people just laughed. "Kids and their wild imaginations," they said. But Margot's grandma believed us. "You saw her," she said, her face pale. "That was Eleanor. She was the innkeeper's daughter. They say her spirit roams the inn on Halloween, looking for anyone foolish enough to wander in." We never went back to the Lantern's Rest, and we never forgot that Halloween. Every time I think about it, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't made it out. "Now remember," I said, looking at the kids, "never go where you're told not to, especially on Halloween." They nodded solemnly, their eyes wide. "Good night," I said, turning off the light. As I closed the door, I couldn't help but smile. Maybe they'd sleep, or maybe they wouldn't. Sure, let's dive deeper into the story and make it longer. That night, after Margot's grandmother told us about Eleanor's haunting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing that dragging sound in my mind, the sound that chased us out of the inn. It was almost as if Eleanor's lantern was still flickering somewhere in the shadows, waiting for us to return. "I don't like it," Callum said the next day at school. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. "I keep thinking I saw something moving in the dark outside my window last night." "I've been having the same dreams," Margot said quietly. "I keep seeing her face, pale, gaunt, and staring at me." I hadn't told them yet, but I too had dreams. Dreams of that long hallway, and of Eleanor standing in front of us, her eyes glowing with a strange light. Her lips moving as if she was whispering something we couldn't quite understand. I knew that the inn wasn't just an old building. It was a place tied to something dark, something that didn't want us to leave. A week passed, and things seemed to settle back to normal. Or so we thought. One chilly evening, a knock came at our door. It was Margot, standing on our porch, looking pale. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Something's wrong," she whispered. I don't know how to explain it, but something's not right." "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping outside to meet her. "Last night," she began, her voice trembling. "I was walking home from the library, and when I passed by the inn..." She stopped, eyes darting nervously. "I swear I saw her. Eleanor. She was standing in the window, holding the lantern. And I swear the light flickered at me like she was calling me to come back." My heart dropped into my stomach. The thought of returning to the lantern's rest filled me with dread, but something in Margot's voice made me realize we couldn't ignore this anymore. "We have to go back," I said quietly. It was a terrible idea. I knew it then, and I knew it even more as we made our way toward the inn later that evening, under the cover of darkness. I could see the other two, Callum and Theo, walking nervously behind us, their faces pale, but they didn't say a word. We had all been thinking the same thing. Eleanor was calling to us, and if we didn't go back, we would never know why. "I don't like this," Theo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like we're walking into a trap." "I know," Callum muttered, "but we can't just leave it hanging, can we?" We walked through the quiet streets of Ember Hollow, the cold wind picking up as we neared the inn. The trees around us seemed to groan under the weight of the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. The full moon hung high above us, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. As we reached the front gate of the Lantern's Rest, the gate creaked open by itself as if inviting us in. The house loomed before us, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. I looked at my friends, their faces filled with a mix of curiosity and terror. "Let's get it over with," Margot said, stepping forward. We followed her inside. The air inside the inn was thick, almost suffocating. It felt like something was pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet as we moved through the dark hallways, our flashlights flickering and casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. "We need to find her," I said, my voice unsteady. "We need to know what she wants." We crept through the inn, retracing our steps from the Halloween night. But this time it felt different. It wasn't just a creepy old building. It was alive, as if it had been waiting for us to come back. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. As we reached the main hallway, I heard the faintest sound like a soft whisper. It was too quiet to make out the words, but it sounded like it was coming from behind one of the doors. "Did you hear that?" Theo asked, his eyes wide with fear. "I heard it too," I whispered. We all stood frozen for a moment, listening. The whispering grew louder, but it was still indecipherable. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open on its own. We all stared at it, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Then a lantern flickered to life in the dark room, casting its warm glow onto the walls. "She's here," Margot said, her voice shaking. We had no choice. We had to go in. The lantern called to us, just like before. Slowly, we made our way toward the door, each step heavy with dread. The closer we got, the louder the whispers became, until it felt like they were coming from all around us. When we entered the room, there she was, Eleanor. She stood in the center of the room, her face pale, her eyes glowing faintly, and her lips moving as if she were speaking to us. The room was filled with a strange, otherworldly light that made everything look distorted. "Eleanor," I said, stepping forward, "what do you want from us?" She stopped moving and looked at us with a sad, haunting expression. Then, in a voice so soft we could barely hear it, she spoke. "Help me." The words echoed in the room, sending chills down my spine. "Help you?" I asked, confused. "My soul is trapped," she said, her voice growing more desperate. "I cannot rest until the truth is revealed. The curse is tied to this inn, and to the night of the terrible fire." Eleanor's story spilled out to us, slowly at first, then faster and faster, as if she couldn't hold it in any longer. She told us of the fire that had started in the inn many years ago, a fire that was set on purpose by a group of people who wanted to take revenge on her family. She was just a child then, and her parents had been trapped in the flames. But Eleanor had survived, only to watch her family perish. And in her grief, she had been consumed by the flames herself, her spirit bound to the inn for eternity. "They did this to me," she whispered, her eyes filled with sorrow. "They never meant for me to die. But now, my soul is trapped, and I cannot rest until I know the truth of who did this to me." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What were we supposed to do? How could we help her? Suddenly there was a noise, like a door slamming open in the distance. Eleanor's face twisted in fear. "They're coming," she said. "The ones who caused the fire. They're coming back." We turned and ran, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind us. Eleanor's lantern flickered and then went out, leaving us in complete darkness. The house groaned, its walls closing in on us. I glanced at my friends. "We can't stay here any longer. We have to leave." But even as we turned to run, I felt like Eleanor was right there with us, her spirit pushing us forward. And in that moment, I knew we couldn't forget her. We couldn't forget the truth. And as we ran out of the inn, back into the safety of the moonlit streets of Ember Hollow, I knew our lives would never be the same again. But Eleanor's story was only just beginning. We never returned to the Lantern's Rest after that night. But sometimes when the wind is right, I hear the faint whispers of Eleanor's voice calling for help. And I know that one day, the truth of the fire will be revealed. Until then, I carry her story with me, just like the shadows of Ember Hollow, always there, always waiting. The kids stared up at me wide-eyed. "So, do you think she's still out there?" one of them asked quietly. "I don't know," I said, pulling the covers up over them. "But if you ever find yourself near the Lantern's Rest on a cold Halloween night, remember one thing. Some stories never end. They live on in the whispers, the shadows, and the forgotten corners of our world." I kissed them goodnight and turned off the light. As I walked down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was still watching, waiting for someone to finally hear her call.